Chapter 29 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 29. The Streets. After dinner, G.J. walked a little eastwards from the club, and, entering Leicester Square from the south, crossed it, and then turned westwards again on the left side of the road leading to Piccadilly Circus. It was about the time when Christine usually went from her flat to her promenade. Without admitting a definite resolve to see Christine that evening, he had said to himself that he would rather like to see her, or that he wouldn't mind seeing her, and that he might, if the mood took him, call at Cork Street and catch her before she left. Having advanced thus far in the sketch of his intentions, he had decided that it would be a pity not to take precautions to encounter her in the street, assuming that she had already started but had not reached the theatre. The chance of meeting her on her way was exceedingly small. Nevertheless, he would not miss it. Hence his roundabout route, and hence his selection of the chaste as against the unchaste pavement of Coventry Street. He knew very little of Christine's professional arrangements, but he did know, from occasional remarks of hers, that, owing to the need for economy and the difficulty of finding taxis, she now always walked to the promenade on dry nights, and that from her motives of self-respect she always took the south side of Piccadilly and the south side of Coventry Street, in order to avoid the risk of ever being mistaken for something which she was not. It was a dry night, but very cloudy. Points of faint illumination, mysteriously travelling across the heavens and revealing the otherwise invisible cushioned surface of the clouds, alone showed that searchlights were at their work of watching over the heedless town. Entertainments had drawn in the people from the streets. Motor buses were half empty. Implacable parcels vans, with thin, exhausted boys scarcely descried on their rear perches, forced the more fragile traffic to yield place to them. Footfarers were few, except on the north side of Coventry Street, where officers, soldiers, civilians, police, and courtesans marched eternally to and fro, peering at one another in the thick gloom that, except in the immediate region of a lamp, put all girls, the young and the aging, the pretty and the ugly, the good-natured and the grasping, on a sinister, enticing equality. And they were all, men and women and vehicles, phantoms, flitting and murmuring and hooting in the darkness. And the violet glowworms that hung in front of theatres and cinemas seemed to mark the entrances to unimaginable fastnesses, and the side streets seemed to lead to the precipitous edges of the universe, where nothing was. G.J. recognized Christine just beyond the knot of loiterers at the Piccadilly Tube. The improbable had happened. She was walking at what was for her a rather quick pace, purposeful and preoccupied. For an instant the recognition was not mutual. He liked the uninviting stare that she gave him as he stopped. "It is thou?" she exclaimed, and her dimly seen face softened suddenly into a delighted, adoring smile. He was moved by the passion which she still had for him. He felt vaguely and yet acutely an undischarged obligation in regard to her. It was the first time he had met her in such circumstances. A constraint fell between them. In 5 minutes she would have been in her promenade, engaged upon her highly technical business, displaying her attractions while appearing to protect herself within a virginal timidity, for this was her natural method. In any case, even had he not set forth on purpose to find her, he could scarcely have accompanied her to the doors of the theatre and there left her to the night's routine. They both hesitated, and then, without a word, he turned aside, and she followed close, acquiescent by training and by instinct. Knowing his sure instinct for what was proper, she knew at once that hazard had saved her from the night's routine, and she was full of quiet triumph. He, of course, though absolutely loyal to her, had, for dignity's sake, to practise the duplicity of pretending to make up his mind what he should do. They went through the tube station, and were soon in one of the withdrawn streets between Coventry Street and Pall Mall East. The episode had somehow the air of an adventure. He looked at her. The hat was possibly rather large, but in truth she was the image of refinement, delicacy, virtue, virtuous surrender. He thought it was marvellous that there should exist such a woman as she, and he thought how marvellous was the protective vastness of the town beneath whose shield he was free, free to live different lives simultaneously, to make his own laws, to maintain indefinitely exciting and delicious secrecies. Not half a mile off were Concepcion and Queen, and his amour was as safe from them as if he had hidden it in the depths of some haremed Asiatic city. Christine said politely, "But I detain thee?" "As for that," he replied, "what does that matter after all?" "Thou knowest," she said in a new tone, "I am all that is most worried. In this London they are never willing to leave you in peace." "What is it, my poor child?" he asked benevolently. "They talk of closing the promenade," she answered. "Never," he murmured easily, reassuringly. He remembered the night, years earlier, when, as a protest against some restrictive action of a county council, the theatre of variety whose promenade rivalled throughout the whole world even the promenade of the Folies Bergères, shut its doors and darkened its blazing façade, and the entire West End seemed to go into a kind of shocked mourning. But the next night the theatre had reopened as usual, and the promenade had been packed. Close the promenades? Absurd! Not the full bench of archbishops and bishops could close the promenades. The thing was inconceivable, especially in wartime, when human nature was so human. "But it is quite serious," she cried. "Every one speaks of it. What idiots, what frightful lack of imagination, and how unjust! What do they suppose we are going to do, we other women? Do they intend to put respectable women like me onto the pavement? It is a fantastic idea, fantastique. And the night-clubs closing too." "There is always the other place." "The Ottoman? Do not speak to me of the Ottoman. Moreover, that also will be suppressed. They are all mad." She gave a great sigh. "Oh, what a fool I was to leave Paris! After all, in Paris they know what it is, life. However, I weary thee. Let us say no more about it." She controlled her agitation. The subject was excessively delicate, and that she should have expressed herself so violently on it showed the powerful reality of the emotion it had aroused in her. Unquestionably, the decency of her livelihood was at stake. She had convinced him of the parable. But what could he say? He could not say, "Do not despair, you are indispensable, therefore you will not be dispensed with." These crises have often arisen before, and they always end in the same manner. And are there not the big hotels, the chic cinemas, certain restaurants, not to mention the clientele which you must have made for yourself? Such remarks were impossible, but not more impossible than the very basis of his relations with her. He was aware again of the weight of an undischarged obligation to her. His behaviour towards her had always been perfection, and yet was she not his creditor? He had a conscience, and it was illogical and extremely inconvenient. At that moment a young man flew along the silent, shadowed street, and as he passed them shouted somewhat historically the one word, "Zeps!" Christine clutched his arm. They stood still. "Do not be frightened," said G.J. with perfect tranquillity. "But I hear guns," she protested. He too heard the distant sounds of guns, and it occurred to him that the sounds had begun earlier while they were talking. "I expect it's only anti-aircraft practice," he replied. "I seem to remember seeing a warning in the paper about their being practised one of these nights." Christine, increasing the pressure on his arm and apparently trying to drag him away, complained, "They ought to give warning of raids. That is elementary. This country is so bizarre." "Oh," said G.J., full of wisdom and standing his ground. "That would never do. Warnings would make panics, and they wouldn't help in the least. We are just as safe here as anywhere. Even supposing there is an air raid, the chance of any particular spot being hit must be several million to 1 against. And I don't think for a moment there is an air raid." "Why?" "Well, I don't," G.J. answered with calm superiority. The fact was that he did not know why he thought there was not an air raid. To assume that there was not an air raid, in the absence of proof positive of the existence of an air raid, was with him constitutional, a state of mind precisely as illogical, biased, and credulous as the alarmist mood which he disdained in others. Also, he was lacking in candour, for after a few seconds the suspicion crept into his mind that there might indeed be an air raid, and he would not utter it. "In any case," said Christine, "they always give warnings in Paris." He thought, "I'd better get this woman home," and said aloud, "Come along." "But is it safe?" she asked anxiously. He saw that she was the primeval woman, exactly like Concepcion and Queen. First she wanted to run, and then, when he was ready to run, she asked, "Is it safe?" And he felt very indulgent and comfortably masculine. He admitted that it would be absurd to expect the conduct of a frightened Christine to be governed by the operations of reason. He was not annoyed, because personally he simply did not care a whit whether they moved or not. While they were hesitating, a group of people came round the corner. These people were talking loudly, and as they approached G.J. discerned that one of them was pointing to the sky. "There she is! There she is!" shouted an eager voice. Seeing more human society in G.J. and Christine, the group stopped near them. G.J. gazed in the indicated direction, and lo, there was a point of light in the sky. And then guns suddenly began to sound much nearer. "What did I tell you?" said another voice. "I told you they'd cleared the corner at the bottom of St. James's Street for a gun. Now they've got her going. Good for us, they're shooting southwards." Christine was shaking on G.J.'s arm. It's all right, he murmured compassionately, and she tightened her clutch on him in thanks. He looked hard at the point of light, which might have been anything. The changing forms of thin clouds continually baffled the vision. "By God!" shouted the first voice. "She's hit! See her stagger? She's hit! She'll blaze up in a moment. One down last week, another this. Look at her now! She's afire!" The group gave a weak cheer. Then the clouds cleared for an instant and revealed a crescent. G.J. said, "That's the moon, you idiot! It's not a Zeppelin!" Even as he spoke, he wondered, and regretted, that he should be calling them idiots. They were complete strangers to him. The group vanished, crestfallen, round another corner. G.J. laughed to Christine. Then the noise of guns was multiplied. That he was with Christine in the midst of an authentic air raid could no longer be doubted. He was conscious of the wine he had drunk at the club. He had the sensation of human beings, men like himself, who ate and drank and laced their boots, being actually at that moment up there in the sky with intent to kill him and Christine. It was a marvellous sensation, terrible but exquisite. And he had the sensation of other human beings beyond the sea giving deliberate orders in German for murder, murdering for their lives. And they, too, were like himself, and ate and drank and either laced their boots or had them laced daily. And the staggering apprehension of the miraculous lunacy of war swept through his soul. Chapter 30. The Child's Arm. "You see," he said to Christine, "it was not a Zeppelin. We should be quite safe here." But in that last phrase he had now confessed to her the existence of an air raid. He knew that he was not behaving with the maximum of sagacity. There were, for example, hotels with subterranean grill rooms close by, and there were similar refuges where danger would be less than in the street, though the street was narrow and might be compared to a trench. And yet he had said, "We shall be quite safe here." In others he would have condemned such an attitude. Now, however, he realized that he was very like others. An inactive fatalism had seized him. He was too proud, too idle, too negligent, too curious to do the wise thing. He and Christine were in the air raid, and in it they should remain. He had just the senseless, monkeyish curiosity of the staring crowd, so lyrically praised by the London press. He was afraid, but his curiosity and inertia were stronger than his fear. Then came a most tremendous explosion, the loudest sound, the most formidable physical phenomenon that G.J. had ever experienced in his life. The earth under their feet trembled. Christine gave a squeal and seemed to subside to the ground, but he pulled her up again, not in calm self-possession, but by the sheer automatism of instinct. A spasm of horrible fright shot through him. He thought, in awe and stupefaction, a bomb. He thought about death and maiming and blood. The relations between him and those everyday males aloft in the sky seemed to be appallingly close. After the explosion, perfect silence. No screams, no noise of crumbling. Perfect silence, and yet the explosion seemed still to dominate the air. Ears ached and sang. Something must be done. All theories of safety had been smashed to atoms in the explosion. G.J. dragged Christine along the street, he knew not why. The street was unharmed. Not the slightest trace in it, so far as G.J. could tell in the gloom, of destruction. But where the explosion had been, whether east, west, south, or north, he could not guess. Except for the disturbance in his ears, the explosion might have been a hallucination. Suddenly he saw at the end of the street a wide thoroughfare, and he could not be sure what thoroughfare it was. 2 motor buses passed the end of the street at mad speed, then 2 taxis, then a number of people, men and women, running hard. Useless and silly to risk the perils of that wide thoroughfare. He turned back with Christine. He got her to run. In the thick gloom he looked for an open door or a porch, but there was none. The houses were like the houses of the dead. He made more than one right-angled turn. Christine gave a sign that she could go no further. He ceased trying to drag her. He was recovering himself. Once more he heard the guns, childishly feeble after the explosion of the bomb. After all, one spot was as safe as another. The outline of a building seemed familiar. It was an abandoned chapel. He knew he was in St. Martin Street. He was about to pull Christine into the shelter of the front of the chapel, when something happened for which he could not find a name. True, it was an explosion. But the previous event had been an explosion, and this one was 1,000-fold more intimidating. The earth swayed up and down. The sound alone of the immeasurable cataclysm annihilated the universe. The sound and the concussion transcended what had been conceivable. Both the sound and the concussion seemed to last for a long time. Then, like an afterthought, succeeded the awful noise of falling masses and the innumerable crystal tinkling of shattered glass. This noise ceased and began again. G.J. was now in a strange condition of mild wonder. There was silence in the dark solitude of St. Martin Street. Then the sound of guns supervened once more, but they were distant guns. G.J. discovered that he was not holding Christine, and also that instead of being in the middle of the street, he was leaning against the door of a house. He called faintly, "Christine!" No reply. "In a moment," he said to himself, "I must go out and look for her. But I am not quite ready yet." He had a slight pain in his side. It was naught. It was naught, especially in comparison with the strange conviction of weakness and confusion. He thought, "We've not won this war yet," and he had qualms. One poor lamp burned in the street. He started to walk slowly and uncertainly towards it. Nearby he saw a hat on the ground. It was his own. He put it on. Suddenly the street lamp went out. He walked on and stepped ankle-deep into broken glass. Then the road was clear again. He halted. Not a sign of Christine. He decided that she must have run away, and that she would run blindly, and, finding herself either in Leicester Square or Lower Regent Street, would by instinct run home. At any rate, she could not be blown to atoms, for they were together at the instant of the explosion. She must exist, and she must have had the power of motion. He remembered that he had had a stick. He had it no longer. He turned back, and, taking from his pocket the electric torch which had lately come into fashion, he examined the road for his stick. The sole object of interest which the torch revealed was a child's severed arm, with a fragment of brown frock on it and a tinsel ring on one of the fingers of the dirty little hand. The blood from the other end had stained the ground. G.J. abruptly switched off the torch. Nausea overcame him, and then a feeling of the most intense pity and anger overcame the nausea. A month elapsed before he could mention his discovery of the child's arm to anyone at all. The arm lay there as if it had been thrown there. Whence had it come? No doubt it had come from over the housetops. He smelt gas, and then he felt cold water in his boots. Water was advancing in a flood along the street. Broken mains, of course, he said to himself, and was rather pleased with the promptness of his explanation. At the elbow of St. Martin Street, where a new, dim vista opened up, he saw policemen, then firemen. Then he heard the beat of a fire engine, upon whose brass glinted the reflection of flames that were flickering in a gap between 2 buildings. A huge pile of debris encumbered the middle of the road. The vista was closed by a barricade, beyond which was a pressing crowd. "Stand clear there," said a policeman to him roughly. "There's a wall going to fall there any minute." He walked off, hurrying with relief from the half-lit scene of busy, dim silhouettes. He could scarcely understand it, and he was incapable of replying to the policeman. He wanted to be alone and to ponder himself back into perfect composure. At the elbow again he halted afresh, and as he stood, figures in couples bearing stretchers strode past him. The stretchers were covered with cloths that hung down. Not the faintest sound came from beneath the cloths. After a time he went on. The other exit of St. Martin's Street was being barricaded as he reached it. A large crowd had assembled, and there was a sound of talking like steady rain. He pushed grimly through the crowd. He was set apart from the idle crowd. He would tell the crowd nothing. In a minute he was going westwards on the left side of Coventry Street again. The other side was as populous with saunterers as ever. The violet glowworm still burned in front of the theatres and cinemas. Motor buses swept by, taxis swept by, parcels vans swept by hooting. A newsman was selling papers at the corner. Was he in a dream now, or had he been in a dream in St. Martin's Street? The vast capacity of the capital for digesting experience seemed to endanger his reason. Save for the fragments of eager conversation everywhere overheard, there was not a sign of disturbance of the town's habitual life. And he was within 400 yards of the Child's Arm and of the spot where the procession of stretcher-bearers had passed. One thought gradually gained ascendancy in his mind. I am saved. It became exultant. I might have been blown to bits, but I am saved. Despite the world's anguish and the besetting imminence of danger, life and the city which he inhabited had never seemed so enchanting, so lovely, as they did then. He hurried towards Cork Street, hopeful. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 31. Romance. At two periods of the day, Martha, with great effort and for professional purposes, achieved some degree of personal tidiness. The first period began about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By 6 o'clock or 6:30 she had slipped back into the sloven. The second period began at about 10 o'clock at night. It was more brilliant while it lasted, but owing to the accentuation of Martha's characteristics by fatigue, it seldom lasted more than an hour. When Martha opened the door to G.J., she was at her proudest, intensely conscious of being clean and neat, and unwilling to stand any nonsense from anybody. Of course she was polite to G.J. as the chief friend of the establishment and a giver of good tips, but she deprecated calls by gentlemen in the evening, for unless they were made by appointment, the risk of complications at once arose. The mention of an air raid rendered her definitely inimical. Formerly Martha had been more than average nervous in air raids, but she had grown used to them and now defied them. As she kept all windows closed on principle, she heard less of raids than some people. G.J. did not explain the circumstances. He simply asked if Madame had returned. No, Madame had not returned. True, Martha had not been unaware of guns and things, but there was no need to worry. Madame must have arrived at the theatre long before the guns started. Martha really could not be bothered with these unnecessary apprehensions. She had her duties to attend to like other folks, and they were heavy, and she washed her hands of air raids. She accepted no responsibility for them. For her, within the flat, they did not exist, and the whole German war machine was thereby foiled. G.J. was on the point of a full explanation, but he checked himself. A recital of the circumstances would not immediately help, and it might hinder. Concealing his astonishment at the excesses of which unimaginative stolidity is capable even in an Italian, he turned down the stairs again. He stopped in the middle of the stairs, because he did not know what he was going to do, and he seemed to lack force for decisions. No harm could have happened to Christine. She had run off, that was certain. And yet, had he not often heard of the impish tricks of explosions, of one person being taken and another left? Was it not possible that Christine had been blown to the other end of the street and was now lying there? No. Either she was on her way home, or automatically she had scurried to the theatre, which was close to St. Martin's Street, and been too fearful to venture forth again. Perhaps she was looking somewhere for him. Yet she might be dead. In any case, what could he do? Ring up the police? It was too soon. He decided that he would wait in Cork Street for half an hour. This plan appealed to him, for the mere reason that it was negative. As he opened the front door, he saw a taxi standing outside. The taxi-man had taken one of the lamps from its bracket and was looking into the interior of the cab, which was ornate with toy curtains and artificial flowers, to indicate to the world that he was an owner-driver and understood life. Hearing the noise at the door, he turned his head. He was wearing a bowler hat and a smart white muffler, and said to G.J., with self-respecting respect for a gentleman, "This is number 170, isn't it, sir?" "Yes." The taxi-man jerked his head to draw G.J.'s attention to the interior of the vehicle. Christine was half on the seat and half on the floor, unconscious, with shut eyes. Instantly G.J. was conscious of making a complete recovery from all the effects, physical and moral, of the air raid. "Just help me to get you out, will you?" he said in a casual tone, "and I'll carry her upstairs. Where did you pick the lady up?" "Strand, sir, nearly opposite Romano's." "The dickens you did!" "Shock from air raid, I suppose, sir?" "Probably." "She did seem a little upset when she hailed me, or I shouldn't have taken her. I was off home, and I only took her to oblige." The taxi-man ran quickly round to the other side of the cab and entered it by the off door, behind Christine. Together the men lifted her up. "I can manage her," said G.J. calmly. "Excuse me, sir, you'll have to get hold of her lower down, so as her waist will be nearly as high as your shoulder. My brother's a fireman." "Right," said G.J. "By the way, what's the fare?" Holding Christine across his shoulder with the right arm, he unbuttoned his overcoat with his left hand and took out change from his trouser pocket for the driver. "You might pull the door to after me," he said in response to the driver's expression of thanks. "Certainly, sir." The door banged. He was alone with Christine on the long, dark, inclement stairs. He felt the contours of her body through her clothes. She was limp, helpless. She was a featherweight. She was nothing at all, inexpressibly girlish, pathetic, dear. Never had G.J. felt as he felt then. He mounted the stairs rather quickly, with firm, disdaining steps, and, despite his being a little out of breath, he had a tremendous triumph over the stolidity of Martha when she answered his ring. Martha screamed, and in the scream readjusted her views concerning air raids. "It's queer, this swoon lasting such a long time," he reflected, when Christine had been deposited on the sofa in the sitting-room, and the common remedies and tricks tried without result, and Martha had gone to the kitchen to make hot water hotter. He had established absolute empire over Martha. He had insisted on Martha not being silly, and yet, though he had already been silly himself in his absurd speculations as to the possibility of Christine's death, he was now in danger of being silly again. Did ordinary swoons ever continue as this one was continuing? Would Christine ever come out of it? He stood with his back to the fireplace, and her head and shoulders were right under him, so that he looked almost perpendicularly down upon them. Her face was as pale as ivory. Every drop of blood seemed to have left it. The same with her neck and bosom. Her limbs had dropped anyhow, in disarray. Her fur jacket was untidily cast over her black muslin dress. But her waved hair, fresh from the weekly visit of the professional coiffeur, remained in the most perfect order. G.J. looked round the room. It was getting very shabby. Its pale, enamelled shabbiness and the tawdry ugliness of nearly every object in it had never repelled and saddened him as they did then. The sole agreeable item was a large photograph of the mistress in a rich silver frame which he had given her. She would not let him buy knick-knacks or draperies for her drawing-room. She preferred other presents. And now that she lay in the room, but with no power to animate it, he knew what the room really looked like. It looked like a dentist's waiting-room, except that no dentist would expose copies of La Vie Parisienne to the view of clients. It had no more individuality than a dentist's waiting-room. Indeed, it was a dentist's waiting-room. He remembered that he had had similar ideas about the room at the beginning of his acquaintance with Christine, but he had partially forgotten them, and, moreover, they had not by any means been so clear and desolating as in that moment. He looked from the photograph to her face. The face was like the photograph, but in the swoon its wistfulness became unbearable. And it was so young. What was she, 27? She could not be 28. No age. A girl. And talk about experience. She had had scarcely any experience, save one kind of experience. The monotony and narrowness of her life was terrifying to him. He had 50 interests, but she had only one. All her days were alike. She had no change and no holiday, no past and no future, no family, no intimate friends, unless Martha was an intimate friend, no horizons, no prospects. She witnessed life in London through the distorting, mystifying veil of a foreign language imperfectly understood. She was the most solitary girl in London, or she would have been were there not 100,000 or so others in nearly the same case. Stay, once she had delicately allowed him to divine that she had been to Bournemouth with a gentleman for a week-end. He could recall nothing else. Nightly, or almost nightly, she listened to the same insufferably tedious jokes in the same insufferably tedious review. But the authorities were soon going to deprive her of the opportunity of doing that, and then she would cease to receive even the education that reviews can furnish, and in her mind no images would survive but images connected with the material arts of love. For, after all, what had they truly in common, he and she, but a periodical, transient excitation? When next he looked at her, her eyes were wide open and a flush was coming, as imperceptibly as the dawn, into her cheeks. He took her hands again and rubbed them. Martha returned, and Christine drank. She gazed in weak silence first at Martha and then at G.J. After a few moments no one spoke. Martha took off Christine's boots and rubbed her stockinged feet, and then kissed them violently. "Madame should go to bed." "I am better." Martha left the room, seeming resentful. "What has passed?" Christine murmured, without smiling. "A faint in the taxi, my poor child, that was all," said G.J. calmly. "But how is it that I find myself here?" "I carried thee upstairs in my arms." "Thou?" "Why not?" He spoke lightly, with careful negligence. "It appears that thou wast in the Strand." "Was I? I lost thee. Something tore thee from me. I ran. I ran till I could not run. I was sure that never more should I see thee alive. Oh, my Gilbert, what terrible moments! What a catastrophe! Never shall I forget those moments." G.J. said with bland supremacy, "But it is necessary that thou shouldst forget them. Master thyself. Thou knowest now what it is, an air raid. It was an ordinary air raid. There have been many like it. There will be many more. For once we were in the middle of a raid, by chance. But we are safe. That is enough." "But the deaths?" He shook his head. "But there must have been many deaths." "I do not know. There will have been deaths. There usually are." He shrugged his shoulders. Christine sat up and gave a little screech. "Ah!" she burst out, her features suddenly transformed by enraged protest. "Why wilt thou act thy cold man?" He was amazed at the sudden nervous strength she showed. "But, my little one," she cried, "why wilt thou act thy cold man? I shall become mad in this sacred England. I shall become totally mad. You are all the same, all men and women. You are marvels, let it be so, but you are not human. Do you then wish to be taken for telegraph poles? Always you are pretending something, pretending that you have no sentiments, and you are soaked in sentimentality. But no, you will not show it. You will not applaud your soldiers in the streets. You will not salute your flag. You will not salute even a corpse. You have only one phrase. It is nothing. If you win a battle, it is nothing. If you lose one, it is nothing. If you are nearly killed at an air raid, it is nothing. And if you were killed outright and could yet speak, you would say with your eternal sneer, it is nothing. You other men, you make love with the air of turning on a tap. As for your women, God knows. But I have a horror of English women. Prudes, but wantons. Can I not guess? Always hypocrites, always holding themselves in. My God, that pinched smile! And your women of the world especially. Have they a natural gesture? Yet does not everyone know that they are rotten with vice and perversity? And your actresses, and they talk of us. Ah, well, for me I can say that I earn my living honestly, every sou of it. For all that I receive, I give. And they would throw me onto the pavement to starve, me whose function in society. She collapsed in sobs, and with averted face held out her arms in appeal. G.J., at once admiring and stricken with compassion, bent and clasped her neck, and kissed her, and kept his mouth on hers. Her tears dropped freely on his cheeks. Her sobs shook both of them. Gradually the sobs decreased in violence and frequency. In an infant's broken voice she murmured into his mouth, "My wolf, is it true that thou didst carry me here in thy arms? I am so proud." He was not in the slightest degree irritated or grieved by her tirade, but the childlike changeableness and facility of her emotions touched him. He savoured her youth, and himself felt curiously young. It was the fact that within the last year he had grown younger. He thought of great intellectuals, artists, men of action, princes, kings, historical figures, in whom courtesans had inspired immortal passion. He thought of the illustrious courtesans who had made themselves heroic in legend, women whose loves were countless and often venal, and yet whose renown had come down to posterity as gloriously as that of supreme poets. He thought of lifelong passionate attachments which to the world were inexplicable, and which the world never tired of leniently discussing. He overheard people saying, "Yes, picked her up somewhere in a promenade. She worships him, and he adores her. Don't know where he hides her. You see them about together sometimes, at concerts for instance. Mysterious-looking creature she is. Plays the part very well, too. Strange affair, but of course there's no accounting for these things." The role attracted him, and there could be no doubt that she did worship him utterly. He did not analyze his feelings for her, perhaps could not. She satisfied something in him that was profound. She never offended his sensibilities, nor wearied him. Her manners were excellent, her gestures full of grace and modesty, her temperament extreme. A unique combination. And if the tie between them was not real and secure, why should he have yearned for her company that night after the scenes with Concepcion and Queen? Those women challenged him, discomposed him, fretted him, fought him, left his nerves raw. She soothed. Why should he not, in the French phrase, put her among her own furniture? In a proper artistic environment, an environment created by himself, of taste and moderate luxury, she would be exquisite. She would blossom, and she would blossom for him alone. She would live for his footstep on her threshold, and when he was not there, she would dream amid cushions like a cat. In the right environment, she would become another being, that was to say the same being, but orchidized. And when he was old, when he was 65, she would still be young, still be under 40, and seductive. And the publishing of his last will and testament, under which she inherited all, would render her famous throughout all the West End, and the word romance would spring to every lip. He searched in his mind for the location of suitable flats. "Is it true that thou didst carry me in thine arms?" repeated Christine. He murmured into her mouth, "Is it true? Can she doubt? The proof, then." And he picked her up as though she had been a doll, and carried her into the bedroom. As she lay on the bed, she raised her arm and looked at the broken wrist-watch, and sighed. "My mascot! It is not a blague, my mascot." Shortly afterwards she began to cry again, at first gently, then sobs supervened. "She must sleep," he said firmly. She shook her head. "I cannot. I have been too upset. It is impossible that I should sleep." "She must." "Go and buy me a drug." "If I go and buy her a drug, will she undress and get into bed while I am away?" She nodded. Calling Martha and taking the latch key of the street door, he went to his chemist's in Dover Street and bought some potassium bromide and sal volatile. When he came back, Martha whispered to him, "She sleeps. She has told me everything as I undressed her. The poor child." Chapter 32. Mrs. Brading. G.J. went home at once, partly so that Christine should not be disturbed, partly because he desired solitude in order to examine and compose his mind. Mrs. Brading had left an agreeably modest fire, fit for cold April, in the drawing-room. He just sat down in front of it and was tranquillizing himself in the familiar, harmonious beauty of the apartment, which, however, did seem rather insipid after the decorative excesses of Queen's room, when he heard footsteps on the little stairway from the upper floor. Mrs. Brading entered the drawing-room. This was a Mrs. Brading very different from the Mrs. Brading of 1914, a shameless creature of more rounded contours than of old, and not quite so spick and span as of old. She was carrying in her arms that which before the war she could not have conceived herself as carrying. The being was invisible in wraps, but it was there, and she seemed to have no shame for it, seemed indeed to be proud of it and defiant about it. Brading's military career had been full of surprises. He had expected within a few months of joining the colours to be dashing gloriously and homicidally at panic-stricken Germans across the plains of Flanders, to be in fact saving the Empire at the muzzle of rifle and the point of bayonet. In truth, he had found that for innumerable weeks his job was to save the Empire by cleaning harness on the east coast of England, for under advice he had transferred to the artillery. Later, when his true qualifications were discovered, he had to save the Empire by polishing the buttons and serving the morning tea and buying the cigarettes of a major who in 1914 had been a lawyer by profession and a soldier only for fun. The major talked too much and to the wrong people. He became lyric concerning the talents of Brading to a dandiacal divisional general at Colchester, and soon, by the actuating of mysterious forces and the filling up of many army forms, Brading was removed to Colchester, and had to save the Empire by valeting the divisional general. Foiled in one direction, Brading advanced in another. By tradition, when a valet marries a lady's maid, the effect on the birth rate is naught, and it is certain that, but for the war, Brading would not have permitted himself to act as he did. The Empire, however, needed citizens. The first rumour that Brading had done what in him lay to meet the need spread through the kitchens of the Albany like a new gospel, incredible and stupefying, but which imposed itself. The Albany was never the same again. All the kitchens were agreed that Mr. Hope would soon be stranded. The spectacle of Mrs. Brading as she slipped out of a morning past the porter's lodge mesmerized beholders. At last, when things had reached the limit, Mrs. Brading slipped out and did not come back. Meanwhile, a much younger sister of hers had been introduced into the flat. But when Mrs. Brading went, the Virgin went also. The flat was more or less closed, and Mr. Hope had slept at his club for weeks. At length the flat was reopened, but whereas 3 had left it, 4 returned. That a bachelor of Mr. Hope's fastidiousness should tolerate in his home a woman with a tiny baby was remarkable. It was as astounding, perhaps, as any phenomenon of the war, and a sublime proof that Mr. Hope realized that the Empire was fighting for its life. It arose from the fact that both G.J. and Brading were men of considerable sagacity. Brading had issued an order, after seeing G.J., that his wife should not leave G.J.'s service. And Mrs. Brading too had her sense of duty. She was very proud of G.J.'s war work, and would have thought it disloyal to leave him in the lurch, and so possibly prejudice the war work, especially as she was convinced that he would never get anybody else comparable to herself. At first she had been a little apologetic and diffident about her offspring, but soon the man-child had established an important position in the flat, and though he was generally invisible, his individuality pervaded the whole place. G.J. had easily got accustomed to the new inhabitant. He tolerated and then liked the babe. He had never nursed it, for such an act would have been excessive, but he had once stuck his finger in its mouth, and he had given it a perambulator that folded up. He did venture secretly to hope that Brading would not imagine it to be his duty to provide further for the needs of the Empire. That Mrs. Brading had grown rather shameless in motherhood was shown by her quite casual demeanour as she now came into the drawing-room with the baby, for this was the first time she had ever come to the drawing-room with the baby, knowing her august master to be there. "Mrs. Brading," said G.J., "that child ought to be asleep." "He is asleep, sir," said the woman, glancing into the mysteries of the immortal package. "But Maria hasn't been able to get back yet because of the raid, and I didn't want to leave him upstairs alone with the cat. He slept all through the raid." "It seems some of you have made the cellar quite comfortable." "Oh, yes, sir, particularly now with the oil stove and the carpet. Perhaps one night you'll come down, sir." "I may have to. I shouldn't have been much surprised to find some damage here tonight. They've been very close, you know, near Leicester Square." He could not be troubled to say more than that. "Have they really, sir? It's just like them," said Mrs. Brading. And then she continued in exactly the same tone, "Lady Queenie Paul has just been telephoning from Letchford House, sir." She still, despite her marvellous experiences, impishly loved to make extraordinary announcements as if they were nothing at all. And she felt an uplifting satisfaction in having talked to Lady Queenie Paul herself on the telephone. "What does she want?" G.J. asked impatiently. and not at all in a voice proper for the mention of a Lady Queenie to a Mrs. Brading. He was annoyed. He resented any disturbance of the repose which he so acutely needed. Mrs. Brading showed that she was a little shocked. The old harassed look of bearing up against complex anxieties came into her face. "Her ladyship wished to speak to you, sir, on a matter of importance. I didn't know where you were, sir." That last phrase was always used by Mrs. Brading when she wished to imply that she could guess where G.J. had been. He did not suppose that she was acquainted with the circumstances of his amour, but he had a suspicion amounting to conviction that she had conjectured it, as men of science, from certain derangements in their calculations, will conjecture the existence of a star that no telescope has revealed. "Well, better leave Lady Queenie alone for to-night." "I promised her ladyship that I would ring her up again in any case in a quarter of an hour. That was approximately 10 minutes ago." He could not say, "Be hanged to your promises." Reluctantly he went to the telephone himself, and learned from Lady Queenie, who always knew everything, that the raiders were expected to return in about half an hour, and that she and Concepcion desired his presence at Letchford House. He replied coldly that he was too tired to come, and was indeed practically in bed. "But you must come, don't you understand we want you?" said Lady Queenie autocratically, adding, "And don't forget that business about the hospitals. We didn't attend to it this afternoon, you know." He said to himself, "And whose fault was that?" and went off angrily, wondering what mysterious power of convention it was that compelled him to respond to the whim of a girl whom he scarcely even respected. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 33. The Roof. The main door of Letchford House was ajar, and, at the sound of G.J.'s footsteps on the marble of the porch, it opened. Robin, the secretary, stood at the threshold. Evidently she had been set to wait for him. "The men servants are all in the cellars," said she, perkily. G.J. retorted with sardonic bitterness, "And quite right, too. I'm glad someone's got some sense left." Yet he did not really admire the man-servants for being in the cellars. Somehow it seemed mean of them not to be ready to take any risks, however unnecessary. Robin, hiding her surprise and confusion in a nervous snigger, banged the heavy door, and led him through the halls and up the staircases. As she went forward, she turned on electric lamps here and there in advance, turning them off by the alternative switches after she had passed them, so that in the vast, shadowed, echoing interior the two appeared to be preceded by light and pursued by a tide of darkness. She was mincingly feminine, and very conscious of the fact that G.J. was a fine gentleman. In the afternoon, and again tonight, at first he had taken her for a mere girl, but as she halted under a lamp to hold a door for him at the entrance to the upper stairs, he perceived that it must have been a long time since she was a girl. Often had he warned himself that the fashion of short skirts and revealed stockings gave a deceitful youthfulness to the middle-aged, and yet nearly every day he had to learn the lesson afresh. He was just expecting to be shown into the boudoir when Robin stopped at a very small door. "His ladyship and Mrs. Carter Smith are up on the roof. This is the ladder," she said, and illuminated the ladder. G.J. had no choice but to mount. Luckily he had kept his hat. He put it on. As he climbed, he felt a slight recurrence of the pain in his side which he had noticed in St. Martin's Street. The roof was a very strange, tempestuous place, and insecure. He had an impression similar to that of being at sea, for the wind, which he had scarcely observed in the street, made melancholy noises in the new protective wire netting that stretched over his head. This bomb-catching contrivance, fastened on thick iron stanchions, formed a sort of second roof, and was a very solid and elaborate affair which must have cost much money. The upstreaming light from the ladder shaft was suddenly extinguished. He could see nobody, and the loneliness was uncomfortable. Somehow, when Robin had announced that the ladies were on the roof, he had imagined the roof as a large, flat expanse. It was nothing of the kind. So far as he could distinguish in the deep gloom, it had leaden pathways, but on either hand it sloped sharply up or sharply down. He might have fallen sheer into a chasm, or stumbled against the leaden side of a slant. He descried a lofty construction of carved masonry with an iron ladder clamped into it, far transcending the net. Not immediately did he comprehend that it was merely one of the famous Letchford chimney-stacks, looming gigantic in the night. He walked cautiously onward, and came to a precipice, and drew back, startled, and took another pathway at right angles to the first one. Presently the protective netting stopped, and he was exposed to heaven. He had reached the roof of the servants' quarters towards the back of the house. He stood still and gazed, accustoming himself to the night. The moon was concealed, but there were patches of dim stars. He could make out across the empty green park the huge silhouette of Buckingham Palace, and beyond that the tower of Westminster Cathedral. To his left he could see part of a courtyard or small square, with a foreshortened black figure, no doubt a policeman, carrying a flash-lamp. The tree-lined Mall seemed to be utterly deserted. But Piccadilly showed a line of faint stationary lights and still fainter moving lights. A mild hum and the sounds of motor horns and cab whistles came from Piccadilly, where people were abroad in ignorance that the raid was not really over. All the heavens were continually restless with long, shifting rays from the anti-aircraft stations, but the rays served only to prove the power of darkness. Then he heard quick, smooth footsteps. Two figures, one behind the other, approached him, almost running, eagerly, girlishly, with little cries. The first was Queen, who wore a white skirt and a very close-fitting black jersey. Concepcion also wore a white skirt and a very close-fitting black jersey, but with a long mantle hung loosely from the shoulders. Both were bare-headed. "Isn't it splendid, G.J.?" Queen burst out enthusiastically. Again G.J. had the sensation of being at sea, perhaps on the deck of a yacht. He felt that rain ought to have been beating on the face of the excited and careless girl. Before answering, he turned up the collar of his overcoat. Then he said, "Won't you catch a chill?" "I'm never cold," said Queen. It was true. "I shall always come up here for raids in future." "You seem to be enjoying it." "I love it. I love it. I only thought of it tonight. It's the next best thing to being a man, being at the front. It is being at the front." Her face was little more than a pale, featureless oval to him in the gloom, but he could divine from the vibrations of her voice that she was as ecstatic as a young maid at her first dance. "And what about that business interview that you've just asked for on the phone?" G.J. acidly demanded. "Oh, we'll come to that later. We wanted a man here, not to save us, only to save us from ourselves. And you were the best we could think of, wasn't he, Con? But you've not heard about my next bazaar, G.J., have you?" "I thought it was a pageant." "I mean after that, a bazaar. I don't yet know what it will be for, but I've got lots of the most topping ideas for it. For instance, I'm going to have a first aid station." "What for? Air raid casualties?" Queen scorned his obtuseness, pouring out a cataract of swift sentences. "No, first aid to lovely complexions, help for distressed beauties. I shall get Roger Fry to design the station and the costumes of my attendants. It'll be marvellous, and I tell you there'll always be a queue waiting for admittance. I shall have all the latest dodges in the sublime and fatal art of make-up, and anything if the Bond Street gang refuse to help me, I'll damn well ruin them. But they won't refuse, because they know what I'll do. Gontran is coming in with his new steaming process for waving. Con, you must try that. It's a miracle. Waving's no good for my style of coiffure, but it would suit you. You always wouldn't wave, but you've got to now, my seraph. The electric heater works in sections. No danger, no inconvenience to the poor old scalp. The waves will last for 6 months or more. It has to be seen to be believed, and even then you can't believe it. Its only fault is that it's too natural to be natural. But who wants to be natural? This modern craze for naturalness seems to me to be rather unwholesome, not to say perverted. What?" She seized G.J.'s arm convulsively. Concepcion had said nothing. G.J. sought her eyes in the darkness, but did not find them. "So much for the bazaar," he said. Queen suddenly cried aloud. "What is it, Robin? Has Captain Brickley telephoned?" "Yes, my lady," came a voice faintly across the gloom from the region of the ladder shaft. "They'll be coming. They'll be here directly," exclaimed Queen, loosing G.J. and clapping her hands. G.J. thought of Robin affixed to the telephone, and some scarlet-shouldered officer at the War Office quitting duty for the telephone, in order to keep the capricious girl informed of military movements, simply because she had taken the trouble to be her father's daughter, and in so doing had acquired the right to treat the imperial machine as one of her nursery toys. And he became unreasonably annoyed. "I suppose you were cowering in your club during the first act?" she said with vivacity. "Yes," G.J. briefly answered. Once more he was aware of a strong instinctive disinclination to relate what had happened to him. He was too proud to explain, and perhaps too tired. "You ought to have been up here. They dropped 2 bombs close to the National Gallery. Pity they couldn't have destroyed a Landseer or 2 while they were so near. There were either 7 or 8 killed and 18 wounded, so far as is known, but there were probably more. There was quite a fire too, but that was soon got under. We saw it all, except the explosion of the bombs. We weren't looking in the right place. No luck. However, we saw the Zepp. What a shame the moon's disappeared again. Listen, can't you hear the engines?" G.J. shrugged his shoulders. Nothing could be heard above the faint hum of Piccadilly. The wind seemed to have diminished to a chill, fitful zephyr. Concepcion had sat down on a coping. "Look!" she exclaimed in a startled whisper, and sprang erect. To the south, down among the trees, a red light flashed and was gone. The faint, irregular hum of Piccadilly persisted for a couple of seconds, and then was drowned in the loud report which seemed to linger and wander in the great open spaces. G.J.'s flesh crept. He comprehended the mad ecstasy of Queen, and because he comprehended it, his anger against her increased. "Can you see the Zepp?" murmured Queen, as it were ferociously. "It must be within range, or they wouldn't have fired. Look along the lines of the searchlights. One of them, at any rate, must have got on to it. We saw it before. Can't you see it? I can hear the engines, I think." Another flash was followed by another resounding report. More guns spoke in the distance. Then a glare arose on the southern horizon. "Incendiary bomb," muttered Queen. She stood stock still with her mouth open, entranced. The Zeppelin, or the Zeppelins, remained invisible and inaudible. Yet they must be aloft there, somewhere amid the criss-cross of the unresting searchlights. G.J. waited, powerfully impressed, incapable of any direct action, gazing blankly now at the women, and now at the huge, undecipherable heaven and earth, and receiving the chill zephyr on his face. The nearest gun had ceased to fire. Occasionally there was perfect silence, for no faintest hum came from Piccadilly, and nothing seemed to move there. The further guns recommenced, and then the group heard a new sound, rather like the sound of a worn-out taxi accelerating before changing gear. It grew gradually louder. It grew very loud. It seemed to be ripping the envelope of the air. It seemed as if it would last forever, till it finished with a gigantic and intimidating plop, quite near the front of Letchford House. Queen said, "Shrapnel, and a big lump." G.J. could see the quick heave of her bosom imprisoned in the black. She was breathing through her nostrils. "Come downstairs into the house," he said sharply, more than sharply, brutally. "Where in the name of God is the sense of stopping up here? Are you both mad?" Queen laughed lightly. "Oh, G.J., how funny you are! I am really surprised you haven't left London for good before now. By rights, you ought to belong to the Hook-it Brigade. Do you know what they do? They take a ticket to any station, north or west, and when they get out of the train they run to the nearest house and interview the tenant. Has he any accommodation to let? Will he take them in as boarders? Will he take them as paying guests? Will he let the house furnished? Will he let it unfurnished? Will he allow them to camp out in the stables? Will he sell the blooming house? So there isn't a house to be had on the north-western nearer than Leighton Buzzard." "Are you going? Because I am," said G.J. Concepcion murmured, "Don't go." "I shall go, and so will you, both of you." "G.J.," Queen mocked him, "you're in a funk." "I've got courage enough to go anyhow," said he, "and that's more than you have." "You're losing your temper." As a fact, he was. He grabbed at Queen, but she easily escaped him. He saw the whiteness of her skirt in the distance of the roof, dimly rising. She was climbing the ladder up the side of the chimney. She stood on the top of the chimney and laughed again. A gun sounded. G.J. said no more. Using his flash-lamp, he found his way to the ladder shaft and descended. He was in the warm and sheltered interior of the house. He was in another and a saner world. Robin was at the foot of the ladder. She blinked under his lamp. "I've had enough of that," he said, and followed her to the illuminated boudoir, where, after a certain hesitation, she left him. Alone in the boudoir, he felt himself to be a very shamed and futile person, and he was still extremely angry. The next moment Concepcion entered the boudoir. "Ah," he murmured, curiously appeased. "You're quite right," said Concepcion simply. He said, "Can you give me any reason, Con, why we should make a present of ourselves to the Hun?" Concepcion repeated, "You're quite right." "Is she coming?" Concepcion made a negative sign. "She doesn't know what fear is, Queen doesn't." "She doesn't know what sense is. She ought to be whipped, and if I got hold of her, I'd whip her." "She'd like nothing better," said Concepcion. G.J. removed his overcoat and sat down. Chapter 34. In the Boudoir. "We aren't so desperately safe even here," said G.J., firmly pursuing the moral triumph which Concepcion's very surprising and comforting descent from the roof had given him. "Don't go to extremes," she answered. "No, I won't." He thought of the valetry and the cellars, and the impossible humiliation of joining them, and added, "I merely state." Then, after a moment of silence, "By the way, wasn't it only her idea that I should come along, or did the command come from both of you?" The suspicion of some dark, feminine conspiracy revisited him. "It was Queen's idea." "Ah, well, I don't quite understand the psychology of it." "Surely that's plain." "It isn't in the least plain." Concepcion loosed and dropped her cloak, and not even glancing at G.J., went to the fire and teased it with the poker. Bending down with one hand on the graphic and didactic mantelpiece, and staring into the fire, she said, "Queen's in love with you, of course." The words were a genuine shock to his sarcastic and rather embittered and bullying mood. Was he to believe them? The vibrant, uttering voice was convincing enough. Was he to show the conventional incredulity proper to such an occasion? Or was he to be natural, brutally natural? He was drawn first to one course and then to the other, and finally spoke at random, by instinct. "What have I been doing to deserve this?" Concepcion replied, still looking into the fire. "As far as I can gather, it must be your masterful ways at the hospital committee that have impressed her, and especially your unheard-of tyrannical methods with her august mother." "I see. Thanks." It had not occurred to him that he had treated the Marchioness tyrannically. He treated her like anybody else. He now perceived that this was to treat her tyrannically. His imagination leapt forward as he gazed round the weird and exciting room which Queen had brought into existence for the illustration of herself, and as he pictured the slim, pale figure outside clinging in the night to the vast chimney, and as he listened to the faint intermittent thud of far-off guns, he had a spasm of delicious temptation. He was tempted by Queen's connections and her prospective wealth. If anybody was to possess millions after the war, Queen would one day possess millions. Her family and her innumerable powerful relatives would be compelled to accept him without the slightest reserve, for Queen issued edicts, and through all those big people he would acquire immense prestige and influence which he could use greatly. Ambition flared up in him, ambition to impress himself on his era, and he reflected with satisfaction on the strangeness of the fact that such an opportunity should have come to him, the son of a lawyer, solely by virtue of his own individuality. He thought of Christine, and poor little Christine was shrunk to nothing at all. She was scarcely even an object of compassion. She was a prostitute. But far more than by Queen's connections and prospective wealth, he was tempted by her youth and beauty. He saw her beautiful and girlish, and he was sexually tempted. Most of all, he was tempted by the desire to master her. He saw again the foolish, elegant, brilliant thing on the chimney, pretending to defy him and mock at him. And he heard himself commanding sharply, come down and acknowledge your ruler. Come down and be whipped." Or had he not been told that she would like nothing better? And he heard the West End of London and all the country houses saying, "She obeys him like a slave." He conceived a new and dazzling environment for himself, and it was undeniable that he needed something of the kind, for he was growing lonely. Before the war he had lived intensely in his younger friends, but the war had taken nearly all of them away from him. many of them forever. Then he said, in a voice almost resentfully satiric, and wondered why such a tone should come from his lips, "Another of her caprices, no doubt." "What do you mean, another of her caprices?" said Concepcion, straightening herself and leaning against the mantelpiece. He had noticed, only a moment earlier, on the mantelpiece, a large photograph of the Hampstead moulder with some writing under it. "Well, what about that, for example?" He pointed. Concepcion glanced at him for the first time, and her eyes followed the direction of his finger. "That? I don't know anything about it." "Do you mean to say that while you were gossiping till 5 o'clock this morning, she didn't mention it?" "She didn't." G.J. went right on, murmuring, "Wants to do something unusual, wants to astonish the town." "No, no." "Then you seriously tell me she's fallen in love with me, Con?" "I haven't the slightest doubt of it." "Did she say so?" There was a sound outside the door. They both started like plotters in danger, and tried to look as if they had been discussing the weather or the war. But no interruption occurred. "Well, she did. I know I should be thought mischievous. If she had the faintest notion I breathed the least hint to you, she'd quarrel with me eternally, of course. I couldn't bear another quarrel. If it had been anybody else but you, I wouldn't have said a word. But you're different from anybody else, and I couldn't help it. You don't know what Queen is. Queen's a white woman." "So you said this afternoon." "And so she is. She has the most curious and interesting brain, and she's as straight as a man." "I've never noticed it." "But I know, and she's an exquisite companion." And so on, and I expect the scheme is that I am to make love to her and be worried out of my life, and then propose to her, and she'll accept me." The word scheme brought up again his suspicion of a conspiracy. Evidently there was no conspiracy, but there was a plot of one. A nervous breakdown? Was Concepcion merely under an illusion that she had had a nervous breakdown? Or had she in truth had one, and was this singular interview a result of it? Concepcion continued with surprising calm magnanimity. "I know her mind is strange, but it's lovely. No one but me has ever seen into it. She's following her instinct unconsciously, as we all do, you know. And her instinct's right, in spite of everything. Her instinct's telling her just now that she needs a master. And that's exactly what she does need. But you must remember she's very young." "Yes," G.J. interrupted, bursting out with a kind of savagery that he could not explain. "Yes, she's young, and she finds even my age spicy. There'd be something quite amusingly piquant for her in marrying a man nearly 30 years her senior." Concepcion advanced towards him. There she stood in front of him, quite close to his chair, gazing down at him in her tight black jersey and short white skirt. She was wearing black stockings now. Her serious face was perfectly unruffled, and in her worn face was all her experience. All the nights and days on the Clyde were in her face. The scalping of the young Glasgow girl was in her face, and the failure to endure either in work or in love. There was complete silence within and without, not the echo of a gun. G.J. felt as though he were at bay. She said, "People like you and Queen don't want to bother about age. Neither of you has any age, and I'm not imploring you to have her. I'm only telling you that she's there for you if you want her. But doesn't she attract you? Isn't she positively irresistible?" She added with poignancy, "I know if I were a man I should find her irresistible." "Just so." A look of sacrifice came into Concepcion's eyes as she finished. "I'd do anything to make Queen happy." "Yes, you would," retorted G.J. icily, carried away by a ruthless and inexorable impulse. "You'd do anything to make her happy, even for 3 months. Yes, to make her happy for 3 months you'd be ready to ruin my whole life. I know you and Queen." And the mild image of Christine formed in his mind, soothingly, infinitely desirable. What balm after the nerve-racking contact of these incalculable creatures! Concepcion retired with a gesture of the arm, and sat down by the fire. "You're terrible, G.J.," she said wistfully. "Queen wouldn't be thrown away on you, but you'd be thrown away on her. I admit it. I didn't think you had it in you. I never saw a man develop as you have. Marriage isn't for you. You ought to roam in the primeval forest and take and kill." "Not a bit," said G.J., appeased once more. "Not a bit. But the new relation of the sexes aren't in my line." "New? My poor boy, are you so ingenuous after all? There's nothing very new in the relations of the sexes that I know of. They're much what they were in the Garden of Eden." "What do you know of the Garden of Eden?" "I get my information from Milton," she replied cheerfully, as though much relieved. "Have you read Paradise Lost, then, Con?" "I read it all through in my lodgings, and it's really rather good. In fact, the remarks of Raphael to Adam in the 8th book, I think it is, are still just about the last word on the relations of the sexes. Oft times nothing profits more than self-esteem, grounded on just and right, well managed. Of that skill the more thou knowest, the more she will acknowledge thee her head, and to realities yield all her shows." G.J., marvelling, exclaimed with sudden enthusiasm, "By Jove, you're an astounding woman, Con. You do me good." There was a fresh noise beyond the door, and the door opened, and Robin rushed in, blanched and hysterical, and with her seemed to crush in terror. "Oh, madame!" she cried, "as there was no more falling, I went up to the roof, and her ladyship—" She covered her face and sobbed. G.J. jumped up. "Go and see," said Concepcion in a blank voice, not moving. "I can't. It's the message straight from Potsdam that's arrived." End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 35. Queen Dead. G.J. emerged from the crowded and malodorous coroner's court with a deep sense of the rigour and the thoroughness of British justice, and especially of its stolidity. There had been 4 inquests, all upon the bodies of air raid victims: a roadman, his wife, an orphan baby, all belonging to the thick central mass of the proletariat, for a West End slum had received a bomb full in the face, and Lady Queenie Paul. The policemen were stolid, the reporters were stolid, the proletariat was stolid, the majority of the witnesses were stolid, and in particular the representatives of various philanthropic agencies who gave the most minute evidence about the habits and circumstances of the slum, and the jurymen, were very stolid, and never more so than when, with stubby fingers holding ancient pens, they had to sign quantities of blue forms under the strict guidance of a bareheaded policeman. The world of Queenie's acquaintances made a strange, vivid contrast to this grey, grim, blockish world, and the two worlds regarded each other with the wonder and the suspicious resentment of foreigners. Queen's world came expecting to behave as at a cause célèbre of, for example, divorce. Its representatives were quite ready to tolerate unpleasing contacts and long stretches of tedium in return for some glimpse of the squalid and the privilege of being able to say that they had been present at the inquest. But most of them had arrived rather late, and they had reckoned without the coroner, and comparatively few obtained even admittance. The coroner had arrived on the stroke of the hour, in a silk hat and frock coat, with a black bag, and had sat down at his desk and begun to rule the proceedings with an absolutism that no High Court judge would have attempted. He was autocrat in a small, close, sordid room, but he was autocrat. He had already shown his quality in some indirect collisions with the Marquis of Letchford. The Marquis felt that he could not stomach the exposure of his daughter's corpse in a common mortuary with other corpses of he knew not whom. Long experience of the Marquisate had taught him to believe that everything could be arranged. He found, however, that this matter could not be arranged. There was no appeal from the ukase of the coroner. Then he wished to be excused from giving evidence, since his evidence could have no direct bearing on the death. But he was informed by a mere clerk, who had knowledge of the coroner's ways, that if he did not attend, the inquest would probably be adjourned for his attendance. The fact was, the coroner had appreciated as well as anybody that heaven and the war had sent him a cause célèbre of the first class. He saw himself the supreme being of a unique assize. He saw his remarks reproduced verbatim in the papers, for, though localities might not be mentioned, there was no censor's ban upon the obiter dicta of coroners. His idiosyncrasy was that he hid all his enjoyment in his own breast. Even had he had the use of a bench instead of a mere chair, he would never have allowed titled ladies in mirific black hats to share it with him. He was an icy radical, sincere, competent, conscientious, and vain. He would be no respecter of persons, but he was a disrespecter of persons above a certain social rank. He said, "Open that window." And that window was opened, regardless of the identity of the person who might be sitting under it. He said, "This court is unhealthily full, admit no more." And no more could be admitted, though the entire peerage waited without. The Marquis had considered that the inquest on his daughter might be taken first. The other 3 cases were taken first, and even taken concurrently they occupied an immense period of time. All the bodies were, of course, viewed together, and the absence of the jury seemed to the Marquis interminable. He thought the despicable tradesmen were gloating unduly over the damaged face of his daughter. The coroner had been marvellously courteous to the procession of humble witnesses. He could not have been more courteous to the exalted, and he was not. In the sight of the coroner, all men were equal. G.J. encountered him first. "I did my best to persuade her ladyship to come down," said G.J. very formally. "I am quite sure you did," said the coroner with the driest politeness. "And you failed." The policeman had related events from the moment when G.J. had fetched him in from the street. The policeman could remember everything, what everybody had said, the positions of all objects, the characteristics and extent of the wire netting, the exact posture of the deceased girl, the exact minute of his visit. He and the coroner played to each other like well-rehearsed actors. Mrs. Carlos Smith's ordeal was very brief, and the coroner dismissed her with an expression of sympathy that seemed to issue from his mouth like carved granite. With the doctor alone the coroner had become human. The coroner also was a doctor. The doctor talked about a relativist-like extravasation of blood, and said that death had been instantaneous. Said the coroner, "The body was found on the wire netting. It had fallen from the chimney. In your opinion, was the fall a contributory cause of death?" The doctor said, "No." "In your opinion, death was due to an extremely small piece of shrapnel which struck the deceased's head slightly above the left ear, entering the brain?" The doctor said, "Yes." The Marquis of Letchford had to answer questions as to his parental relations with his daughter. How long had he been away in the country? How long had the deceased been living in Letchford House practically alone? How old was his daughter? Had he given any order to the effect that nobody was to be on the roof of his house during an air raid? Had he given any orders at all as to conduct during an air raid? The coroner sympathized deeply with his lordship's position, and felt sure that his lordship understood that. But his lordship would also understand that the policy of heads of households in regard to air raids had more than a domestic interest. It had, one might say, a national interest, and the force of prominent example was one of the forces upon which the government counted, and had the right to count, for help in the regulation of public conduct in these great crises of the most gigantic war that the world had ever seen. "Now, as to the wire netting," had said the coroner, leaving the subject of the force of example, he had a perfect plan of the wire netting in his mind. He understood that the chimney stack rose higher than the wire netting, and that the wire netting went round the chimney stack at a distance of a foot or more, leaving room so that a person might climb up the perpendicular ladder. If a person fell from the top of the chimney stack, it was a chance whether that person fell on the wire netting, or through the space between the wire netting and the chimney onto the roof itself. The jury doubtless understood. The jury, however, at that instant had been engaged in examining the bit of shrapnel which had been extracted from the brain of the only daughter of a marquis. The coroner understood that the wire netting did not extend over the whole of the house. "It extends over all the main part of the house," his lordship had replied. "But not over the back of the house?" His lordship agreed. "The servants' quarters, probably?" His lordship nodded. The coroner had said, "The wire netting does not extend over the servants' quarters," in a very even voice. A faint hiss in court had been extinguished by the sharp glare of the coroner's eyes. His lordship, a thin, antique figure, in a long cloak that none but himself would have ventured to wear, had stepped down, helpless. There had been much signing of depositions. The coroner had spoken of the Hague Convention, mentioning one article by its number. The jury, as to the first 3 cases, in which the victims had been killed by bombs, had returned a verdict of wilful murder against the Kaiser. The coroner, suppressing the applause, had agreed heartily with the verdict. He told the jury that the fourth case was different, and the jury returned a verdict of death from shrapnel. They gave their sympathy to all the relatives, and added a rider about the inadvisability of running unnecessary risks, and the coroner, once more agreeing heartily, had thereon made an effective little speech to a hushed, assenting audience. There were several motor cars outside. G.J. signalled across the street to the taximan who telephoned every morning to him for orders. He had never owned a motor car, and, because he had no ambition to drive himself, had never felt the desire to own one. The taximan experienced some delay in starting his engine. G.J. lit a cigarette. Concepcion came out alone. He had expected her to be with the Marquis, with whom she had arrived. She was dressed in mourning. Only on that day, and once before, on the day of her husband's funeral, had he seen her in mourning. She looked now like the widow she was. Nevertheless, he had not quite accustomed himself to the sight of her in mourning. "I wonder whether I can get a taxi?" she asked. "You can have mine," said he. "Where do you want to go?" She named a disconcerting address near Shepherd's Market. At that moment a pressman with a camera came boldly up and snapped her. The man had the brazen demeanour of a racecourse tout. But Concepcion seemed not to mind at all, and G.J. remembered that she was deeply inured to publicity. Her portrait had already appeared in the picture papers along with that of Queen, but the papers had deemed it necessary to remind a forgetful public that Mrs. Carlos Smith was the same lady as the super-celebrated Concepcion Equist. The taximan hesitated for an instant on hearing the address, but only for an instant. He had earned the esteem and regular patronage of G.J. by a curious hazard. One night G.J. had hailed him, and the man had said in a flash, without waiting for the fare to speak, "The Albany, isn't it, sir? I drove you home about 2 months ago." Thenceforward he had been for G.J. the perfect taximan. In the taxi Concepcion said not a word, and G.J. did not disturb her. Beneath his superficial melancholy he was sustained by the mere joy of being alive. The common phenomena of the streets were beautiful to him. Concepcion's calm and grieved vitality seemed mysteriously exquisite. He had had similar sensations while walking along Coventry Street after his escape from the explosion of the bomb. Fatigue and annoyance and sorrow had extinguished them for a time, but now that the episode of Queen's tragedy was closed, they were born anew. Queen, the pathetic victim of the indiscipline of her own impulses, was gone. But he had escaped. He lived. And life was an affair miraculous and lovely. "I think I've been here before," said he, when they got out of the taxi in a short, untidy, indeterminate street that was a cul-de-sac. The prospect ended in a garage, near which 2 women chauffeurs were discussing a topic that interested them. A hurdy-gurdy was playing close by, and a few ragged children stared at the hurdy-gurdy, on the end of which a baby was cradled. The fact that the street was midway between Curzon Street and Piccadilly, and almost within sight of the monumental new mansion of an American duchess, explained the existence of the building in front of which the taxi had stopped. The entrance to the flats was mean and soiled. It repelled, but Concepcion unapologetically led G.J. up a flight of 4 stone steps and round a curve into a little corridor. She halted at a door on the ground floor. "Yes," said G.J. with admirable calm, "I do believe you've got the very flat I once looked at with a friend of mine. If I remember, it didn't fill the bill because the tenant wouldn't sublet it, unfurnished. When did you get hold of this?" "Yesterday afternoon," Concepcion answered. "Quick work, but these feats can be accomplished. I've only taken it for a month. Hotels seem to be all full. I couldn't open my own place at a moment's notice, and I didn't mean to stay on at Letchford House, even if they'd asked me to." G.J.'s notion of the vastness and safety of London had received a shock. He was now a very busy man, and would quite sincerely have told anybody who questioned him on the point that he hadn't a moment to call his own. Nevertheless, on the previous morning he had spent a considerable time in searching for a nest in which to hide his Christine and create romance, and he had come to this very flat. More, there had been 2 flats to let in the block. He had declined them, the better one because of the furniture, the worse because it was impossibly small, and both because of the propinquity of the garage. But supposing that he had taken one and Concepcion the other? He recoiled at the thought. Concepcion's new home, if not impossibly small, was small, and the immensity and abundance of the furniture made it seem smaller than it actually was. Each little room had the air of having been furnished out of a huge and expensive second-hand emporium. No single style prevailed. There were big carved and inlaid antique cabinets and chests, big hanging crystal candelabra, and big pictures, some of them apparently family portraits, the rest 18th-century flower pieces, in big gilt frames, with a multiplicity of occasional tables and bric-a-brac. Gilt predominated. The ornate cornices were gilded. Human beings had to move about like dwarfs on the tiny free spaces of carpet between frowning cabinetry. The taste and the aim of the author of this home defied deduction. In the first room a charwoman was cleaning. Concepcion greeted her like a sister. In the next room, whose window gave onto a blank wall, tea was laid for one in front of a gas fire. Concepcion reached down a cup and saucer from a glazed cupboard and put a match to the spirit lamp under the kettle. "Let me see, the bedroom's up here, isn't it?" said G.J., pointing along a passage that was like a tunnel. Concepcion, yielding to his curiosity, turned on lights everywhere and preceded him. The passage, hung with massive canvases, had scarcely more than width enough for G.J.'s shoulders. The tiny bedroom was muslined in every conceivable manner. It had a colossal bed, surpassing even Christine's. A muslin maid was bending over some drapery shop boxes on the floor and removing garments therefrom. Concepcion greeted her like a sister. "Don't let me disturb you, Emily," she said, and to G.J., "Emily was poor Queenie's maid, and she's come to me for a little while." G.J. amicably nodded. Tears came suddenly into the maid's eyes. G.J. looked away and saw the bathroom, which, also well muslined, was completely open to the bedroom. "Whose is this marvellous home?" he added, when they had gone back to the drawing-room. "I think the original tenant is the wife of somebody who's interned." "How simple the explanation is," said G.J., "but I should never have guessed it." They started the tea in a strange silence. After a minute or two, G.J. said, "I mustn't stay long." "Neither must I," Concepcion smiled. "Got to go out?" "Yes." There was another silence. Then Concepcion said, "I'm going to Sarah Church's, and as I know she has her pageant committee at 5:30, I'd better not arrive later than 5, had I?" "What is there between you and Lady Churcher?" "Well, I'm going to offer to take Queen's place on the organising committee." "Con," he explained impulsively, "you aren't." In an instant the atmosphere of the little airless, electric-lit, gas-fumed apartment was charged with a fluid that no physical chemistry could have traced. Concepcion said mildly, "I am. I owe it to Queen's memory to take her place if I can. Of course, I'm no dancer, but in other things I expect I can make myself useful." G.J. replied with equal mildness, "You aren't going to mix yourself up with that crowd again, after all you've been through. The pageant business isn't good enough for you, Con, and you know it. You know it's odious." She murmured, "I feel it's my duty. I feel I owe it to Queen. It's a sort of religion with me, I expect. Each person has his own religion, and I doubt if one's more dogmatic than another." He was grieved. He had a sense almost of outrage. He hated to picture Concepcion subduing herself to the horrible environment of the pageant enterprise. But he said nothing more. The silence resumed. They might have conversed with care about the inquest, or about the funeral which was to take place at the castle in Cheshire. Silence, however, suited them best. "Also, I thought you needed repose," said G.J., when Concepcion broke the melancholy enchantment by rising to look for cigarettes. "I must be allowed to work," she answered after a pause, putting a cigarette between her teeth. "I must have something to do, unless, of course, you want me to go to the bad altogether." It was a remarkable saying, but it seemed to admit that he was legitimately entitled to his critical interest in her. "If I'd known that," he said, suddenly inspired, "I should have asked you to take on something for me." He waited. She made no response, and he continued, "I'm secretary of my small affair since yesterday. The paid secretary, a nice enough little thing, has just run off to the Women's Auxiliary Corps in France and left me utterly in the lurch. Just like domestic servants, these earnest girl clerks are, when it comes to the point. No imagination. Wanted to wear khaki, and no doubt thought she was doing a splendid thing. Never occurred to her the mess I should be in. I'd have asked you to step into the breach. You'd have been frightfully useful. But I'm no girl clerk, Concepcion gently and carelessly protested. Well, she wasn't either. I shouldn't have wanted you to be a typist. We have a typist. As a matter of fact, her job needed a bit more brains than she's got. However... Another silence. G.J. rose to depart. Concepcion did not stir. She said softly, I don't think anybody realizes what Queen's death is to me. Not even you. On her face was the look of sacrifice which G.J. had seen there as they talked together in Queen's boudoir during the raid. He thought amazed, and they'd only had about 24 hours together, and part of that must have been spent in making up their quarrel. Then aloud, I quite agree. People can't realize what they haven't had to go through. I've understood that ever since I read in the paper the day before yesterday that 2 bombs fell close together and one immediately after the other in a certain quarter of the West End. That was all the papers said about those 2 bombs. Why, what do you mean? And I understand it when poor old Queen gave me some similar information on the roof. What do you mean? I was between those 2 bombs when they fell. One of them blew me against a house. I've been to look at the place since, and I'm dashed if I myself could realize then what I've been through. She gave a little cry. Her face pleased him. And you weren't hurt? I had a pain in my side, but it's gone, he said laconically. And you never said anything to us. Why not? Well, there were so many other things. G.J., you're astounding. No, I'm not. I'm just myself. And hasn't it upset your nerves? Not as far as I can judge. Of course, one never knows, but I think not. What do you think? She offered no response. At length she spoke with queer emotion. You remember that night I said it was a message direct from Potsdam? Well, naturally it wasn't. But you know the thought that tortures me? Supposing the shrapnel that killed Queen was out of a shell made at my place in Glasgow. It might have been. Supposing it was. Con, he said firmly, I simply won't listen to that kind of talk. There's no excuse for it. Shall I tell you what, more than anything else, has made me respect you since Queen was killed? 99 women out of 100 would have managed to remind me, quite illogically and quite inexcusably, that I was saying hard things about poor old Queen at the very moment when she was lying dead on the roof. You didn't. You knew I was very sorry about Queen, but you knew that my feelings as to her death had nothing whatever to do with what I happened to be saying when she was killed. You knew the difference between sentiment and sentimentality. For God's sake, don't start wondering where the shell was made. She looked up at him, saying nothing, and he savoured the intelligence of her weary, fine, alert, comprehending face. He did not pretend to himself to be able to fathom the enigmas of that long glance. He had again the feeling of the splendour of what it was to be alive, to have survived. Just as he was leaving, she said casually, Very well, I'll do what you want. What I want? I won't go to Sarah Church's. You mean you'll come as assistant secretary? She nodded. Only I don't need to be paid. And he too fell into a casual tone. That's excellent. Thus, by this nonchalance, they conspired to hide from themselves the seriousness of that which had passed between them. The grotesque, pretentious little apartment was mysteriously humanized. It was no longer the reception room of a furnished flat by chance hired for a month. They had lived in it. She finished, eagerly smiling. I can practice my religion just as much with you as with Sarah Churcher, can't I? Queen was on your committee too. Yes, I shan't be deserting her. The remark disquieted his triumph. That aspect of the matter had not occurred to him. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 36. Collapse. Later that same afternoon, G.J., in the absence of the chairman, presided as honorary secretary over a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Letchford Hospitals. In the course of the war, the committee had changed its habitation more than once. The hotel which had at first given it a home had long ago been commandeered by the government for a new government department, and its hundreds of chambers were now full of the clicking of typewriters and the dictation of officially phrased correspondence, and the conferences which precede decisions, and the untamed footsteps of messenger flappers, and the making of tea and chatter about cinemas, blouses, and headaches. Afterwards the committee had been the guest of a bank and of a trust company, and had for a period even paid rent to a common landlord. But its object was always to escape the formality of rent-paying, and it was now lodged in an untenanted mansion belonging to a viscount in a great Belgravian square. Its sign was spread high across the facade, its posters were in the windows, and on the door was a notice such as in 1914 nobody had ever expected to see in that quadrangle of guarded sacred castles: "Turn the handle and walk in." The mansion, though much later in date, was built precisely on the lines of a typical Bloomsbury boarding-house. It had the same basement, the same general disposition of rooms, the same abundance of stairs and paucity of baths, the same chilly draughts and primeval devices for heating, and the same superb disregard for the convenience of servants. The patrons of domestic architecture had permitted architects to learn nothing in 70 years, except that chimney flues must be constructed so that they could be cleaned without exposing sooty infants to the danger of suffocation or incineration. The committee sat on the first floor in the back drawing-room, whose furniture consisted of a deal table, Windsor chairs, a row of hat pegs, a wooden box containing coal, half a poker, 2 unshaded lights. The walls, from which all the paper had been torn off, were decorated with lists of subcommittees, posters, and rows of figures scrawled here and there in pencil. The room was divided from the main drawing-room by the usual folding doors. The smaller apartment had been chosen in the winter because it was somewhat easier to keep warm than the other one. In the main drawing-room the honorary secretary camped himself at a desk near the fireplace. When the clock struck, G.J., one of whose monastic weaknesses was a ritualistic regard for punctuality, was in his place at the head of the table, and the table well filled with members, for the honorary secretary's harmless foible was known and admitted. The table and the chairs, the scraping of the chair legs on the bare floor, the agenda papers, and the augmentation thereof by absent-minded pens, were the same as in the committee's youth. But the personnel of the committee had greatly changed, and it was enlarged, as its scope had been enlarged. The 2 Ledgeford hospitals behind the French lines were now only a part of the committee's responsibilities. It had a special hospital in Paris, 2 convalescent homes in England, and an important medical unit somewhere in Italy. Finance was becoming its chief anxiety, for the reason that, though soldiers had not abandoned in disgust the practice of being wounded, philanthropists were unquestionably showing signs of fatigue. It had collected money by postal appeals, by advertisements, by selling flags, by competing with drapers' shops, by intimidation, by ruse and guile, and by all the other recognized methods. Of late it had depended largely upon the very wealthy, and to a less extent upon G.J., who, having gradually constituted the committee his hobby, had contributed some thousands of pounds from his share of the magic profits of the Rivali Company. Everybody was aware of the immense importance of G.J.'s help. G.J. never showed it in his demeanour, but the others continually showed it in theirs. He had acquired authority. He had also acquired the sure manner of one accustomed to preside. "Before we begin on the agenda," he said, and as he spoke a late member crept apologetically in and tiptoed to the heavily charged hat-pegs, "I would like to mention about Miss Trevoz. Some of you know that, through an admirable but somewhat disordered sense of patriotism, she has left us at a moment's notice. I am glad to say that my friend Mrs. Carlos Smith, who I may tell you has had a very considerable experience of organisation, has very kindly agreed, subject of course to the approval of the committee, to step temporarily into the breach. She will be an honorary worker, like all of us here, and I am sure that the committee will feel as grateful to her as I do." As there had been smiles at the turn of his phrase about Miss Trevoz, so now there were fervent, almost emotional hear-hears. "Mrs. Smith, will you please read the minutes of the last meeting?" Concepcion was sitting at his left hand. He kept thinking, "I'm one of those who get things done." 2 hours ago, and the idea of enlisting her had not even occurred to him. and already he had taken her out of her burrow, brought her to the offices, coached her in the preliminaries of her allotted task, and introduced several important members of the committee to her. It was an achievement. Never had the minutes been listened to with such attention as they obtained that day. Concepcion was apparently not in the least nervous, and she read very well, far better than the deserter Mr. was, who could not open her mouth without bridling. Concepcion held the room. Those who had not seen before the celebrated Concepcion Equist now saw her and sated their eyes upon her. She had been less a woman than a legend. The romance of South America enveloped her, and the romance of her famous and notorious uncle, of her triumph over the West End, her startling marriage and swift widowing, her journey to America and her complete disappearance, her attachment to Lady Queenie, and now her dramatic reappearance. And the sharp condiment to all this was the general knowledge of the bachelor G.J.'s long intimacy with her, and of their having both been at Letchford House on the night of the raid, and both been at the inquest on the body of Lady Queenie Paul on that very day. But nobody could have guessed from their placid and self-possessed demeanour that either of them had just emerged from a series of ordeals. They won a deep and full respect. Still, some people ventured to have their own ideas, and an ingenuous few were surprised to find that the legend was only a woman after all, and a rather worn woman, not indeed very recognizable from her innumerable portraits. Nevertheless, the respect for the pair was even increased when G.J. broached the first item on the agenda, a resolution of respectful sympathy with the Marquis and Marchioness of Letchford in their bereavement, a profound appreciation of the services of Lady Queenie on the committee, and of an intention to send by the chairman to the funeral a wreath to be subscribed for by the members. G.J. proposed the resolution himself, and it was seconded by a lady and supported by a gentleman, whose speeches gave no hint that Lady Queenie had again and again, by her caprices, nearly driven the entire committee into a lunatic asylum, and had caused several individual resignations. G.J. put the resolution without a tremor. It was impressively carried, and Concepcion wrote down the terms of it quite calmly in her secretarial notes. The performance of the pair was marvellous, and worthy of the English race. Then arrived Sir Stephen Braden. Sir Stephen was chairman of the French Hospitals Management Subcommittee. G.J. said, "Sir Stephen, you are just too late for the resolution as to Lady Queenie Paul." "I deeply apologize, Mr. Chairman," replied the aged but active Sir Stephen, nervously stroking his rather long beard. "I hope, however, that I may be allowed to associate myself very closely with the resolution." After a suitable pause and general silence, he went on, "I've been detained by that Nurse Smith that my subcommittee's been having trouble with. You'll find, when you come to them, that she's on my subcommittee's minutes. I've just had an interview with her, and she says she wants to see the executive. I don't know what you think, Mr. Chairman." He stopped. G.J. smiled. "I should have brought her in," said the lady who had previously spoken. "If I might suggest," she added. A Boy Scout, who seemed to have long ago grown out of his uniform, entered with a note for somebody. He was told to bring in Nurse Smith. She proved to be a rather short and rather podgy woman, with a reddish, not rosy, complexion and red hair. The ugly red-bordered cape of the British Red Cross did not suit her better than it suited any other wearer. She was in full, strict, starched uniform, and prominently wore medals on her plenteous breast. She looked as though, if she had a sister, that sister might be employed in a large draper's shop at Bristol or Islington. In saying "Good afternoon," she revealed the purity of a Cockney accent undefiled by continental experiences. She sat down in a manner sternly defensive. She was nervous and abashed, but evidently dangerous. She belonged to the type which is courageous in spite of fear. She had resolved to interview the committee, and though the ordeal frightened her, she desperately and triumphantly welcomed it. "Now, Nurse Smith," said G.J. diplomatically, "we are always very glad to see our nurses, even when our time is limited. Will you kindly tell the committee as briefly as possible just what your claim is?" And the nurse replied, with medals shaking, "I'm claiming, as I've said before, 2 weeks' salary in lieu of notice, and my fare home from France. 25 francs salary and 95 francs expenses, and I say nothing of excess luggage." "But you didn't come home." "I have come home, though." One of those members whose destiny it is always to put a committee in the wrong remarked, "But surely, nurse, you left our employer nearly a year ago. Why didn't you claim before?" "I've been at you for 2 months at least, and I was ill for 6 months in Turin. They had to put me off the train there," said Nurse Smith, getting self-confident. "As I understand," said G.J., "you left us in order to join a Serbian unit of another society, and you only returned to England in February." "I didn't leave you, sir. That is, I left you, but I was told to go." "Who told you to go?" "Matron." Sir Stephen benevolently put in, "But the matron had always informed us that it was you who said you wouldn't stay another minute. We have it in the correspondence." "That's what she says, but I say different, and I can prove it," said G.J. "There must be some misunderstanding. We have every confidence in the matron, and she's still with us." "Then I'm sorry for you." He turned warily to another aspect of the subject. "Do I gather that you went straight from Paris to Serbia?" "Yes, the unit was passing through, and I joined it." "But how did you obtain your passport? You had no certificate from us." Nurse Smith tossed her perilous red hair. "Oh, no difficulty about that. I'm not without friends, as you may say." Some of the committee looked up suspiciously, aware that the matron had in her report hinted at mysterious relations between Nurse Smith and certain authorities. "The doctor in charge of the Serbian unit was only too glad to have me. Of course, if you're going to believe everything matron says—" Her tone was becoming coarser, but the committee could neither turn her out nor cure her natural coarseness, nor indicate to her that she was not using the demeanour of committee rooms. She was firmly lodged among them, and she went from bad to worse. "Of course, if you're going to swallow everything matron says, it isn't as if I was the only one." "May I ask if you are at present employed?" "I don't quite see what that's got to do with it," said Nurse Smith, still gaining ground. "Certainly not. Nothing at all. I was only hoping that these visits here are not inconvenient to you." "Well, as it seems so important, I might say I'm going out to Salonika next week, and that's why I want this business settled." She stopped, and as the committee remained diffidently and apprehensively silent, she went on, "It isn't as if I was the only one. Why, when we were in the retreat of the Serbian army over the mountains, I came across by chance, if you call it chance, another nurse that knew all about her. Been under it in Bristol for a year." A young member, pricking up, asked, "Were you in the Serbian retreat, nurse?" "If I hadn't been, I shouldn't be here now," said Nurse Smith, entirely recovered from her stage fright and entirely pleased to be there then. "I lost all I had at Ypres. All I took was my medals, and then I did take. There were 50 of us, British, French, and Russians. We had nearly 3 weeks in the mountains. We slept rough all together in one room, when there was a room, and when there wasn't, we slept in stables. We had nothing but black bread, and that froze in the haversacks, and if we took our boots off, we had to thaw them the next morning before we could put them on. If we hadn't had 3 saucepans, we should have died. When we went down the hills, 2 of us had to hold every horse by his head and tail to keep him from falling. However, nearly all the horses died, and then we took the packs off them and tried to drag the packs along by hand. We soon stopped that. All the bridle paths were littered with dead horses and oxen, and when we came up with the Serbian army, we saw soldiers just drop down and die in the snow. I read in the paper there were no children in the retreat, but I saw lots of children strapped to their mothers' backs. Yes, they fell down together and froze to death. Then we got to Scutari, and glad I was." She glanced round defiantly, but not otherwise moved, at the committee, the hitherto invisible gods of hospitals and medical units. The nipping wind of reality had blown into the back drawing-room. The committee was daunted. But some of its members, less daunted than the rest, had the presence of mind to wonder why it seemed strange and strangely chilling that the rather coarse, stout woman with a Cockney accent and little social refinement should have passed through and emerged so successfully from the unimaginable retreat. If Nurse Smith had been beautiful and slim and of elegant manners, they could not have controlled their chivalrous enthusiasm. "Very interesting," said someone. Glancing at G.J., Nurse Smith proceeded. "You say I didn't come home, but the money for my journey was due to me. That's what I say. 25 francs for 2 weeks' wages and 95 francs journey money." "As regards the journey money, observed Sir Stephen blandly. "We've never played so much, if my recollection serves me. And, of course, we have to remember that we're dealing with public funds." Nurse Smith sprang up, looking fixedly at Concepcion. Concepcion had thrown herself back into her chair, and her face was so drawn that it was no more the same face. "Even if it is public funds," Concepcion shrieked, "can't you give 95 francs in memory of those 3 saucepans?" Then she relapsed onto the table, her head in her hands, and sobbed violently, very violently. The sobs rose and fell in the scale, and the whole body quaked. G.J. jumped to his feet. Half the shocked and alarmed committee was on its feet. Nurse Smith had run round to Concepcion and had seized her with a persuasive, soothing gesture. Concepcion quite submissively allowed herself to be led out of the room by Nurse Smith and Sir Stephen. Her sobs weakened, and when the door was closed, could no longer be heard. A lady member had followed the 3. The committee was positively staggered by the unprecedented affair. G.J., very pale, said, "Mrs. Smith is in competent hands. We can't do anything. I think we had better sit down." He was obeyed. A second doctor on the committee remarked with a curious slight smile, "I said to myself when I first saw her this afternoon that Mrs. Smith had some of the symptoms of a nervous breakdown." "Yes," G.J. concurred. "I very much regret that I allowed Mrs. Smith to come. But she was determined to work, and she seemed perfectly calm and collected. I very much regret it." Then, to hide his constraint, he pulled towards him the sheet of paper on which Concepcion had been making notes, and, remembering that a list of members present had always to be kept, he began to write down names. He was extremely angry with himself. He had tried Concepcion too high. He ought to have known that all women were the same. He had behaved like an impulsive fool. He had been ridiculous before the committee. What should have been a triumph was a disaster. The committee would bind their 2 names together. And at the conclusion of the meeting, news of the affair would radiate from the committee's offices in every direction throughout London. And he had been unfair to Concepcion. Their relations would be endlessly complicated by the episode. He foresaw trying scenes in which she would make all the excuses between her and himself. "Perhaps it would be simpler if we decided to admit Nursemaid's claim," said a timid voice from the other end of the table. G.J. murmured coldly, gazing at the agenda paper and yet dominating his committee. "The question will come up on the minutes of the hospital's management subcommittee. We had better deal with it then. The next business on the agenda is the letter from the Paris Service de Santé." He was thinking, "How is she now? Ought I to go out and see?" And the majority of the committee was vaguely thinking, not without a certain pleasurable malice, "These society women, they're all queer." End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 37. The Invisible Powers. Several times already the rumour had spread in the promenade that the promenade would be closed on a certain date, and the promenade had not been closed. But tonight it was stated that the promenade would be closed at the end of the week, and everybody concerned knew that the prophecy would come true. No official notice was issued. No person who repeated the tale could give a reliable authority for it. Nevertheless, for some mysterious reason, it convinced. The rival promenade had already passed away. The high, invisible powers who ruled the world of pleasure were moving at the behest of powers still higher than themselves, and the cloakroom attendants, in their frivolous, tiny aprons, shared murmuringly behind plush portières in the woe of the ladies with large hats. The review being a failure, the auditorium was more than half empty. In the promenade, to each man there were at least 5 pretty ladies, and the ladies looked gloomily across many rows of vacant seats at the bright proscenium, where jocularities of an exacerbating tedium were being enacted. Not that the jocularities were inane beyond the usual, but failure made them seem so. None had the slightest idea why the review had failed. For precisely similar reviews, concocted according to the same recipe, and full of the same jocularities, executed by the same players at the same salaries, had crowded the theatre for many months together. It was an incomprehensible universe. Christine suddenly shrugged her shoulders and walked out. What use in staying to the end? It was long after 10 o'clock, and an exquisite faint light lingering in the sky still revealed the features of the people on the streets. The man who had devoted half a life to the ingenious project of lengthening the summer days by altering clocks was in his disappointed grave. But victory had come to him there, for statesmen had at last proved the possibility of that which they had always maintained to be impossible, and the wisdom of that which they had always maintained to be idiotic. The voluptuous divine melancholy of evening June descended upon the city from the sky, and even sounds were beautifully sad. The happy progress of the war could not exorcise this soft, omnipotent melancholy. Yet the progress of the war was nearly all that could be desired. Verdun was held, and if Fort Vaux had been lost, there had been compensation in the fact that the enemy, through the gesture of the Crown Prince in allowing the captured commander of the fort to retain his sword, had done something to rehabilitate themselves in the esteem of mankind. Lord Kitchener was drowned, but the discovery had been announced that he was not indispensable. Indeed, there were those who said that it was better thus. The Easter Rebellion was well in hand. Order was understood to reign in an Ireland hidden behind the black veil of the censorship. The mighty naval battle of Jutland had quickly transformed itself from a defeat into a brilliant triumph. The disturbing prices of food were about to be reduced by means of a committee. In America, the Republican forces were preparing to eject President Wilson in favor of another Hughes, who could be counted upon to realize the world destiny of the United States. An economic conference was assembling in Paris with the object of cutting Germany off from the rest of the human race after the war. And in 11 days the Russians had made prisoners of 150,000 Austrians, and Brusilov had just said, "This is only the beginning." Lastly, the close prospect of the resistless Allied Western offensive, which would deracinate Prussian militarism, was uplifting men's minds. Christine walked nonchalantly and uninvitingly through the streets, quite unresponsive to the exhilaration of events. "Martha," she called when she had let herself into the flat. Contrary to orders, the little hall was in darkness. There was no answer. She lit the hall and passed into the kitchen, lighting it also. There, in the terrible and incurable squalor of Martha's own kitchen, Martha's apron was thrown untidily across the back of the solitary Windsor chair. She knew then that Martha had gone out, and in truth, although very annoyed, she was not altogether surprised. Martha had a mysterious love affair. It was astonishing, in view of the intensely aphrodisiacal atmosphere in which she lived, that Martha did not continually have love affairs. But the day of love had seemed for Martha to be over, and Christine found great difficulty in getting her even to leave the flat, save on necessary household errands. On the other hand, it was astonishing that any man should be attracted by the fat slattern. The moth now fluttering round her was an Italian waiter, as to whom Christine had learnt that he was being unjustly hunted by the Italian military authorities. Hence the mystery necessarily attaching to the love affair. Being French, Christine despised him. He called Martha by her right name of Marta, and Christine had more than once heard the pair gabbling in the kitchen in Italian. Just as though she had been a conventional bourgeoise, Christine now accused Martha of ingratitude because the woman was subordinating Christine's convenience to the supreme exigencies of fate. A man's freedom might be in the balance, Martha's future might be in the balance, but supposing that Christine had come home with a gallant, and no femme de chambre to do service? She walked about the flat, shut the windows, drew the blinds, removed her hat, removed her glove, stretched them, put her things away. She gazed at the two principal rooms, at the soiled numbers of La Vie Parisienne and the cracked bric-a-brac in the drawing-room, at the rent in the lace bed-cover, and the foul mess of toilet apparatus in the bedroom. The forlorn emptiness of the place appalled her. She had been quite fairly successful in her London career. Hundreds of men had caressed her and paid her with compliments and sweets and money. She had been really admired. The flat had had gay hours. Unmistakable aristocrats had yielded to her, and she had escaped the 5 scourges of her profession. It was all over. The chapter was closed. She saw nothing in front of her but decline and ruin. She had escaped the 5 scourges of her profession, but part of the price of this immunity was that, through keeping herself to herself, she had not a friend. Despite her profession, and because of the prudence with which she exercised it, she was a solitary, a recluse. Yes, of course she had Gilbert. She could count upon Gilbert to a certain extent, to a considerable extent. But he would not be eternal, and his fancy for her would not be eternal. Once, before Easter, she had had the idea that he meant to suggest to her an exclusive liaison. Foolish! Nothing, less than nothing, had come of it. He would not be such an imbecile as to suggest such a thing to her. Miracles did not happen, at any rate not that kind of miracle. In the midst of her desolation, an old, persistent dream revisited her. The dream of a small country cottage in France, with a dog, a faithful servant, respectability, good name, works of charity, her own praying-stool in the village church. She moved to the wardrobe, and unlocked one of the drawers beneath the wide doors. And, rummaging under the linen and under the photographs under the linen, she drew forth a package and spread its contents on the table in the drawing-room. Her securities, her bonds of the city of Paris, ever increasing. Gilbert had tried to induce her to accept more attractive investments, but she would not. Never. These were her consols, part of her religion. Bonds of the city of Paris had fallen in value, but not in her dogmatic esteem. The passionate little miser that was in her surveyed them with pleasure, even with assurance, but they were still far too few to stand for the realization of her dream. And she might have to sell some of them soon in order to live. She replaced them carefully in the drawer, with dejection unabated. When she glanced at the table again, she saw an envelope. Inexplicably, she had not noticed it before. She seized it in hope, and recognized in the address the curious hand of her landlord. It contained a week's notice to quit. The tenancy of the flat was weekly. This was the last blow. All the invisible powers of London were conspiring together to shatter the profession. What in the name of the Holy Virgin had come over the astounding, incomprehensible city? Then there was a ring at the bell. Martha? No, Martha would never ring. She had a key, and she would creep in. A lover? A rich, spendthrift, kind lover? Hope flickered anew in her desolated heart. It was the other pretty lady, a newcomer, who lived in the house, a rather stylish woman of about 35, unusually fair, with regular features and a very dignified carriage, indeed not unimposing. They had met once at the foot of the stairs. Christine was not sure of her name. She proclaimed herself to be Russian, but Christine doubted the assertion. Her French had no trace of a foreign accent, and in view of the achieved merits of the Russian army, ladies were finding it advantageous to be of Russian blood. Still, she had a fine cosmopolitan air to which Christine could not pretend. They engaged each other in glances. "I hope I did not disturb you, madame." "Not at all, madame. I am obliged to open the door myself, because my servant is out." "I thought I heard you come in, and so—" "No," interrupted Christine, determined not to admit the defeat of having returned from the promenade alone. "I have not been out. Probably it was my servant you heard." "Ah, without doubt." "Will you give yourself the trouble to enter, madame?" "Ah!" exclaimed the Russian in the sitting-room. "You will excuse me, madame, but what a beautiful photograph!" "You are too amiable, madame. A friend had it done for me." They sat down. "You are deliciously installed here," said the Russian perfunctorily, looking round. "Now, madame, I have been here only 3 weeks, and tonight I receive a notice to quit. Shall I be indiscreet if I ask if you have received a similar notice?" "This very evening," said Christine, in secret still more disconcerted by this further proof of a general plot against human nature. She was about to add, "I found it here on my return home," but remembering her fib, managed to stop in time. "Well, madame, I know little of London. Without doubt you know London to the bottom. Is it serious, this notice?" "I think so." "Quite serious?" Christine said, "You see, there is a crisis. It is the war that in London has led to the discovery that men have desires. Of course it will pass, but—" "Oh, of course, but it is grotesque, this crisis." "It is perfectly grotesque. Christine agreed. "You do not by hazard know where one can find flats to let? I hear speak of Bloomsbury and of Long Acre, but it seems to me that those quarters—" "I am in London since now more than 18 months," said Christine, "and as for all those things I know little. I have lived here in this flat all the time, and I go out so rarely." The Russian put in with eagerness. "Oh, I go out, so to speak, not at all." "I thought I had seen you once in the promenade of the—" "Yes, it is true," interrupted the Russian quickly. "I went from curiosity, for distraction. You see, since the war I have lived in Dublin. I have there a friend, very highly placed in the administration. He married. One lived terrible hours during the revolt. I decided to come to London, especially as— However, I do not wish to fatigue you with all that." Christine said nothing. The Irish rebellion did not interest her. She was in no mood for talking about the Irish rebellion. She had convinced herself that all Sinn Feiners were in German pay, and naught else mattered. Never, she thought, had the British government carried ingenuousness further than in this affair. Given a free hand, Christine, with her strong, direct common sense, would have settled the Irish question in 48 hours. The Russian, after a little pause, continued, "I merely wished to ask you whether the notice to quit was serious, not a trick for raising the rent." Christine shook her head to the last clause. "And then, if the notice was quite serious, whether you knew of any flats not too dear, not that I mind a good rent if one receives the value of it, and is left tranquil?" The conversation might at this point have taken a more useful turn, if Christine had not felt bound to hold herself up against the other's high tone of indifference to expenditure. The Russian, in demanding tranquillity, had admitted that she regularly practised the profession, or, as English girls strangely call it, the business, and Christine could have followed her lead into the region of gossiping and intimate realism, where detailed confidences are enlighteningly exchanged. But the tone about money was a challenge. "I should have been enchanted to be of service to you," said Christine, "but I know nothing. I go out less and less. As for this notice, I smile at it. I have a friend upon whom I can count for everything. I have only to tell him, and he will put me among my own furniture at once. He has indeed already suggested it. So that je m'en fiche." "I also," said the Russian. "My new friend, he is a colonel sent from Dublin to London, has insisted upon putting me among my own furniture. But I have refused so far because one likes to know more of a gentleman, does one not one, before—" "Truly," murmured Christine. "And there is always Paris," said the Russian. "But I thought you were from Petrograd." "Yes, but I know Paris well." "Ah, there is only Paris. Paris is a second home to me." "Can one get a passport easily for Paris? I mean, supposing the air raids grow too dangerous again?" "Why not, madame, if one has one's papers? To get a passport from Paris to London, that would be another thing. I see that you play," the Russian added, rising with a gesture towards the piano. "I have heard you play. You play with true taste. I know, for when a girl, I played much." "You flatter me." "Not at all. I think your friend plays too." "Ah," said Christine, it is an artist, that one." They turned over the music, exchanged views about waltzes, became enthusiastic, laughed, and parted amid manifestations of good breeding and goodwill. As soon as Christine was alone, she sat down and wept. She could no longer contain her distress. Paris gleamed before her. But no, it was a false gleam. She could not make a new start in Paris during the war. The adventure would be too perilous. The adventure might end in a licensed house. And yet, in London, what was there in London but, ultimately, the pavement? And the pavement meant complications with the police, with prowlers, with other women. It meant all the scourges of the profession, including, probably, alcoholism. It meant prostitution, to which she had never sunk. She wished she had been killed outright in the air raid. She had an idea of going to the oratory the next morning, and perhaps choosing a new Virgin and soliciting favour of the image thereof. She sobbed, and sobbing, suddenly jumped up and ran to the telephone. And even as she gave Gilbert's number, she broke it in the middle with a sob. After all, there was Gilbert. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 38. The Victory. "Get back into bed," said G.J., having silently opened the window in the sitting-room. He spoke with courteous persuasion, but his peculiar intense politeness and restraint somewhat dismayed Christine. By experience she knew that they were a sure symptom of annoyance. She often, though not on this occasion, wished that he would yield to anger and make a scene, but he never did, and she would hate him for not doing so. The fact was that under the agreement which ruled their relations, she had no right to telephone to him, save in grave and instant emergency, and even then it was her duty to say first, when she got the communication, "Mr. Pringle wanted to speak to Mr. Hope." She had omitted in her disquiet to fulfil this formality. Recognizing his voice, she began passionately, without preliminary, "Oh, beloved, thou canst not imagine what has happened to me," etc. Still, he had come. He had cut her short, but he had left whatever he was doing, and had, amazingly, walked over at once. And in the meantime she had hurriedly undressed and put on a new peignoir and slipped into bed. Of course, she had to open the door herself. She obeyed his command like an intelligent little mouse, and he sat down on the edge of the bed. He might inspire foreboding, alarm, even terror, but he was in the flat. He was the saviour, man, in the flat, and his coming was in the nature of a miracle. He might have been out, he might have been entertaining, he might have been engaged. He might well have said that he could not come until the next day. Never before had she made such a request, and he had acceded to it immediately. Her mood was one of frightened triumph. He was being most damnably himself. His demeanour was as faultless as his dress. She could not even complain that he had forgotten to kiss her. He said nothing about her transgression of the rule as to telephoning. He was waiting, with his exasperating sense of justice and self-control, until she had acquainted him with her case. Instead of referring coldly and disapprovingly to the matter of the telephone, he said in a judicious, amicable voice, "I doubt whether your coiffure is all that it ought to be. I see you had your hair waved today." "Yes, why?" "You should tell the fellow to give you the new method of hair waving, streaming with electric heaters, or else go where you can get it." "New method?" repeated Christine, the Tory, doubtfully, and then with sudden sexual suspicion, "Who told you about it?" "Oh, I heard of it months ago," he said carelessly. "Besides, it's in the papers, in the advertisements. It lasts longer, much longer, and it's more artistic." She felt sure that he had been discussing hair-waving with some woman. She thought of all her grievances against him. The Letchford House episode rankled in her mind. He had given her the details, but she said to herself that he had given her the details only because he had foreseen that she would hear about the case from others or read about it in the newspapers. She had not been able to stomach that he should be at Letchford House alone, late at night, with two women of the class she hated and feared, and the very night of her dreadful experience with him in the bomb explosion. No explanations could make that seem proper or fair. Naturally, she had never disclosed her feelings. Further, the frequenting of such a house as Letchford House was more proof of his social importance, and incidentally of his riches. The spectacle of his flat showed her long ago that previously she had been underestimating his situation in the world. The revelations as to Letchford House had seemed to show her that she was still underestimating it. She resented his modesty. She was inclined to attribute his modesty to a desire to pay her as little as he reasonably could. However, she could not in sincerity do so. He treated her handsomely, considering her pretensions, but considering his position, he had no pretensions, not handsomely. She had had an irrational idea that, having permitted her to see the splendour of his flat, he ought to have increased her emoluments, that indeed she should be paid not according to her original environment, but according to his. She also resented that he had never again asked her to his flat. Her behaviour on that sole visit had apparently decided him not to invite her any more. She resented his perfectly hidden resentment. What disturbed her more than anything else was a notion in her mind, possibly a wrong notion, that she cared for him less madly than of old. She had always said to herself, or more than once, sadly, to him, that his fancy for her would not and could not last, but that hers for him should decline puzzled her and added to her grievances against him. She looked at him from the little nest made by her head between two pillows. Did she in truth care for him less madly than of old? She wondered. She had only one gauge, the physical. She began to talk despairingly about Martha, whom of course she had had to mention at the door. He said quietly, "But it's not because of Martha's caprices that I'm asked to come down tonight, I suppose?" She told him about the closing of the promenade in a tone of absolute resigned certainty that admitted of no facile pooh-poohings or reassurances. And then, glancing sidelong at the night-table where the lamp burned, she extended her half-bared arm and picked up the landlord's notice and gave it to him to read. Watching him read it, she inwardly trembled, as though she had started on some perilous enterprise, the end of which might be black desperations, as though she had cast off from the shore and was afloat amid the waves of a vast swollen river, waves that often hid the distant further bank. She felt somehow that she was playing for all or nothing. And though she had had immense experience of men, though it was her special business to handle men, she felt herself to be unskilled and incompetent. The common ruses, feints, devices, guiles, chicaneries were familiar to her. She could employ them as well as any, and better than most. They succeeded marvellously and absurdly in the common embarrassments and emergencies because they had not to stand the test of time. Their purpose was temporary, and when the purpose had been accomplished, it did not matter whether they were unmasked or not, for the adversary victim, who in any event was better treated than he deserved, either had gone for ever or would soon forget, or was too proud to murmur, or philosophically accepted a certain amount of wile as part of the price of ecstasy. But this embarrassment and this emergency were not common. They were a supreme crisis. "The other lady has had notice too," she said, and went on. "It's the same everywhere in this quarter. I know not if it is the same in other districts, but quite probably it is. It is the end." She saw by the lifting of his eyebrows that he was impressed, that he secretly admitted the justifiability of her summons to him. And instantly she took a reasonable, wise, calm tone. "It is a little serious, is it not? I do not frighten myself, but it is serious. Above all, I do not wish to trouble thee. I know all thy anxieties, and I am a woman who understands. But except thee I have not a friend, as I have often told thee. In my heart there is a place only for one. I have a horror of all these women. They weary me. I am not like them, as thou well knowest. Thus my existence is solitary. I have no relations, not one. See, go into no matter what interior, and there are photographs. But here, not one. Yes, one, my own. I am forced to regard my own portrait. What would I not give to be able to put on my chimney-piece thy portrait? But I cannot. Do not deceive thyself. I am not complaining. I comprehend perfectly. It is impossible that a woman like me should have thy photograph on her chimney-piece." She smiled, smoothing for a moment the pucker out of her brow. "And lately I see thee so little. Thou comest less frequently. And when thou comest, well, one embraces, the little music, and then, poof, thou art gone. Is it not so?" He said, "But thou knowest the reason. I am terribly busy. I have all the preoccupations in the world. My committee, it is not all smooth, my committee. Everything and everybody depends on me. And in the committee I have enemies too. The fact is, I have become a beast of burden. I dream about it. And there are others in worse case. We shall soon be in the 3rd year of the war. We must not forget that." "My little rabbit," she replied very calmly and reasonably and caressingly, "do not imagine to thyself that I blame thee. I do not blame thee. I comprehend too well all that thou dost, all that thou art worth. In every way thou art stronger than me. I am 10 times nothing. I know it. I have no grievance against thee. Thou hast always given me what thou couldst, and I, on my part, have never demanded too much. Say, have I been excessive? At this hour I make no claim on thee. I have done all that to me was possible to make thee happy. In my soul I have always been faithful to thee. I do not praise myself for that. I did not choose it. These things are not chosen. They come to pass, that is all. And it arrived that I was bound to go mad about thee, and to remain so. What wouldest thou? Speak not of the war. Is it not because of the war that I am in exile, and that I am ruined? I have always worked honestly for my living. and there is not on earth an officer who has encountered me who can say that I have not been particularly nice to him because he was an officer. Thou wilt excuse me if I speak of such matters. I know I am wrong. It is contrary to my habit. But what wouldst thou? I also have done what I could for the war, but it is my ruin. Oh, my Gilbert, tell me what I must do. I ask nothing from thee but advice. It was for that I dared to telephone thee. G.J. answered casually, I see nothing to worry about. It will be necessary to take another flat, that is all. But I know nothing of London. One tells me that it is in future impossible for women who live alone, like me, to find a flat, that is to say, respectable. Absurd. I will find a flat. I know precisely where there is a flat. But will they let it to me? They will let it to me, I suppose, said he, still casually. A pause ensued. She said, in a voice trembling, Thou art not going to say to me that thou wilt put me among my own furniture? The flat is furnished, but it is the same thing. Do not let such a hope shine before me who saw before me only the pavement. Thou art not serious. I never was more serious. For whom dost thou take me, little foolish one? She cried, Oh, you English, you are chic. You make love as you go to war, like that. One word, it is decided, and there's nothing more to say. Ah, you English. She had almost screamed, shuddering under the shock of his decision, for which she had impossibly hoped, but whose reality overwhelmed her. He sat there in front of her, elegant, impeccably dressed, distinguished, aristocratic, rich, in the full wisdom of his years, and in the strength of his dominating will and in the righteousness of his heart. One could absolutely trust such as him to do the right thing, and to do it generously, and to do it all the time. And she had won him. He had recognized her qualities. She had denied any claim upon him, but by his decision he had admitted a claim that no money could satisfy. After all, for 18 months she had been more to him than any other woman. He had talked freely to her. He had concealed naught from her. He had spoken to her of his discouragements and his weaknesses. He had had no shame before her. By her acquiescences, her skill, her warmth, her adaptability, her intense womanliness, she created between them a bond stronger than anything that could keep them apart. The bond existed. It could not, during the whole future, be broken, save by a disloyalty. A disloyalty, she divined, would irrevocably destroy it. But she had no fear on that score, for she knew her own nature. His decision did more than fill her with a dizzy sense of relief, a mad, intolerable happiness. It re-established her self-respect. No ordinary woman, handicapped as she was, could have captured this fastidious and shy paragon. And the notion that her passion for him had dwindled was utterly ridiculous, like the notion that he would tire of her. She was saved. She burst into wild tears. "Ah, pardon me," she sobbed. "I am quite calm, really, but since the air raid, thou knowest, I have not been quite the same. Thou art different. Nothing could disturb thy calm. Ah, if thou wert a general at the front, what sang-froid, what presence of mind, but I—" He bent towards her, and she suddenly sprang up and seized him round the neck and ate his lips, and while she strangled and consumed him, she kept muttering to him, "Hope not that I shall thank thee. I cannot. The words with which I could thank thee do not exist. But I am thine. Thine, all of me is thine. Humiliate me. Demand of me impossible things. I am thy slave, thy creature. Ah, let me kiss thy beautiful grey hairs. I love thy hair and thy ears." The thought of her insatiable temperament flashed through her as she held him, and of his northern sobriety, and of the profound, unchangeable difference between these two. She would discipline her temperament. She would subjugate it. Women were capable of miracles, and women alone. And she was capable of miracles. A strange muffled noise came to them across the darkness of the sitting-room, and G.J. raised his head slightly to listen. "Repose thyself in the arms of thy little mother," she breathed softly. "It is nothing. It is but the wind blowing the blind against the curtains." And later, when she distilled the magic of the hour and was tranquilized, she said, "And where is it, this flat?" End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 39. Idyll. Christine said to Marie, otherwise La Mère Gaston, the new servant in the new flat, who was holding in her hand a telegram addressed to Hope, Albany, "Give it to me. I will put it in front of the clock on the mantelpiece." And she lodged it among the gilt cupids that supported the clock on the fringed mantelpiece in the drawing-room. She did so with a little gesture of childlike glee, expressing her satisfaction in the flat as a whole. The flat was dark. She did not object, loving artificial light. The rooms were all very small. She loved cosiness. There was a garage close by, which might have disturbed her nights, but it did not. The bathroom was open to the bedroom. No arrangement could be better. G.J., in enumerating the disadvantages of the flat, had said also that it was too much and too heavily furnished. Not at all. She adored the cumbrous and rich furniture. She did not want in her flat the empty spaces of a ballroom. She wanted to feel that she was within an interior, inside something. She gloried in the flat. She preferred it even to her memory of G.J.'s flat in the Albany. Its golden ornateness flattered her. The glittering cornices and the big carved frames of the pictures of impossible flowers and of ladies and gentlemen historic coiffures and costumes appeared marvellous to her. She had never seen, and certainly had never hoped to inhabit, anything like it. But then Gilbert was always better than his word. He had been quite frank, telling her that he knew of the existence of the flat simply because it had been occupied for a brief time by the Mrs. Carlos Smith of whom she had heard and read, and who had had to leave it on account of health. She did not remind him that once, at the beginning of the war, when she had noticed the name and portrait of Mrs. Carlos Smith in the paper, he, sitting by her side, had concealed from her that he knew Mrs. Carlos Smith. Judiciously, she had never made the slightest reference to that episode. Though she detested the unknown Mrs. Carlos Smith, she admired and envied her for a great illustrious personage, and was secretly very proud of succeeding Mrs. Carlos Smith in the tenancy. And when Gilbert told her that he had had his eye on the flat for her because Mrs. Carlos Smith took it, and had hesitated on account of its drawbacks, she was even more proud, and reassured also. For this detail was a proof that Gilbert had really had the intention to put her among her own furniture long before the night of the supreme appeal to him. Only he was always so cautious. And Gilbert was the discovery of La Mère Gaston, too, and as frank about her as about the flat. La Mère Gaston was the widow of a French soldier, domiciled in London previous to the war, who died of wounds in one of the Letchford hospitals, and it was through the Letchford Committee that Gilbert had come across her. A few weeks earlier than the beginning of the former liaison, Mrs. Brading had fallen ill for a space, and Madame Gaston had been summoned as charwoman to aid Mrs. Brading's young sister in the Albany flat. With excellent judgment, Gilbert had chosen her to succeed Martha, whom he himself had reproachfully dismissed from Cork Street. He was amazingly clever, was Gilbert, for he had so arranged things that Christine had been able to cut off her Cork Street career as with a knife. She had departed from Cork Street with 2 trunks and a few cardboard boxes. Her stove was abandoned to the landlord, and vanished into London and left no trace. Except Gilbert, nobody who knew her in Cork Street was aware of her new address, and nobody who knew her in Mayfair knew that she had come from Cork Street. Her ancient acquaintances in Cork Street would ring the bell there in vain. Madame Gaston was a neat, plump woman of perhaps 40, not looking her years. She had a comprehending eye. After 3 words from Gilbert she had mastered the situation, and as she perfectly realized where her interests lay, she could be relied upon for discretion. In all delicate matters, only her eye talked. She was a Protestant, and went to the French church in Soho Square, which we called the Temple. Christine and she had had but one Sunday together, and Christine had gone with her to the Temple. The fact was that Christine had decided to be a Protestant. She needed a religion, and Catholicism had an inconvenience: confession. She had regularized her position, so much so that by comparison with the past she was now perfectly respectable. Yet if she had been candid in the confessional, the priest would still have convicted her of mortal sin, which would have been very unfair, and she could not, in view of her respectability, have remained a Catholic without confessing, however infrequently. Madame Gaston, as soon as she was sure of her convert, referred to Catholicism as idolatry. "Put your apron on, Marie," said Christine. "Monsieur will be here directly." "Ah, yes, madame." "Have you opened the kitchen window to take away the smell of cooking?" "Yes, madame." "Am I all right, Marie?" Madame Gaston surveyed her mistress, who turned round. "Yes, madame. I think that monsieur will much like that negligee." She departed to don the apron. Between these two it was continually "Monsieur, monsieur." He was seldom there, but he was always there, always being consulted, placated, invoked, revered, propitiated, magnified. He was the giver of all good, and there was no other Allah, and he had two prophets. Christine sang, she twittered, she pirouetted out of sheer youthful joy. She had forgotten care and forgotten promiscuity. Good fortune had washed her pure. She looked at herself in the massive bevelled mirror, and saw that she was fresh and young and lithe and graceful. And she felt triumphant. Gilbert had expressed the fear that she might get lonely and bored. He had even said that occasionally he might bring along a man, and that perhaps the man would have a very nice woman friend. She had not very heartily responded. She was markedly sympathetic towards Englishmen, but towards English women, no. And especially she did not want to know any English women in the same situation as herself. Lonely? Impossible. Bored? Impossible. She had an establishment. She had a civil list. Her days passed like an Arabian dream. She never had an unfulfilled moment, and when each day was over she always remembered little things which she had meant to do and had not found time to do. She was a superb sleeper, and arose at noon. 3 o'clock usually struck before her day had fairly begun, unless of course she happened to be very busy, in which case she would be ready for contact with the world at the lunch hour. Her main occupation was to charm, allure, and gratify a man. For that she lived. Her distractions were music, the reading of novels, le journal, and les grandes modes. And for the war she knitted. In her new situation it was essential that she should do something for the war. Therefore she knitted, being a good knitter, and her knitting generally lay about. She popped into the dining-room to see if the table was well set for dinner. It was, but in order to show that Marie did not know everything, she rearranged somewhat the flowers in the central bowl. Then she returned to the drawing-room and sat down at the piano and waited. The instant of arrival approached. Gilbert's punctuality was absolute, always had been. Sometimes it alarmed her. She could not have to wait more than a minute or two, according to the inexactitude of her clock. The bell rang, and simultaneously she began to play a 5-finger exercise. Often in the old life she had executed upon him this innocent subterfuge, to make him think she practised the piano to a greater extent than she actually did, that indeed she was always practising. It never occurred to her that he was not deceived. Here, Marie, fly to the front door. See Christine's face, see her body, as in her pale bright gown she peeps round the half-open door of the drawing-room. She lives then. Her eyes sparkle for the giver of all good, for the adored, and her brow is puckered for him, and the jewels on her hand burn for him, and every pleat of her garments, visible and invisible, is pleated for him. She is a child. She snatched up a chocolate and put it between her teeth, and so she offers the half of it to him, smiling, silent. She is a child, but she is also a woman intensely skilled in her art. "Monster," she said, "come this way." And she led him down the tunnel to the bedroom. There, in a corner of the bathroom, stood an antique closed toilet stand, such as was used by men in the days before splashing and sousing were invented. She had removed it from the drawing-room. "Open it," she commanded. He obeyed. His little compartments, which had been empty, were filled with a man's toilet instruments: brushes, file, scissors, shaving soap, his own brand, a safety razor, etc. The set was complete. She had known exactly the requirements. "It is a little present from thy woman," she said. "In future thou wilt have no excuse. Sit down. Marie." "Madame." "Take off the boots of monsieur." Marie knelt. Christine found the new slippers. "And now this," she said, after he had washed and used the new brushes, producing a black house-jacket with a velvet collar and cuffs. "How tired thou must be after thy day," she murmured, patting him with tiny pats. "Thou knowest, my little one," she said, pointing to the gas stove in the bedroom fireplace. "For the other room's a gas stove. I am indifferent. But the bedroom is something else. The bedroom is sacred. I could not tolerate a gas stove in the bedroom. A coal fire is necessary to me. You do not think so?" "Yes," he said, "you are quite right. It should be seen to." "Can I give the order? Thou permittest me to give the order?" "Certainly." In the drawing-room she cushioned him well in the best easy chair, and, sitting down on a puff near him, began to knit like an industrious wife who understands the seriousness of war. Nothing escaped the attention of that man. He espied the telegram. "What's that?" "Ah!" she cried, springing up and giving it to him. "Stupid that I am, I forgot." He looked at the address. "How did this come here?" he asked mildly. "Marie brought it from the Albany." "Oh." He opened the telegram and read it, having dropped the envelope into the silk-lined, gilded waste-paper basket by the fender. "It is nothing serious?" she questioned. "No, business." He might have shown it to her. He had shown her telegrams before, but he stuck it into his pocket. Then, without a word to Christine, he rang the bell, and Marie appeared. "Marie, the telegram. Why did you bring it here?" "Monsieur, it was like this. I went to Monsieur's flat to fetch 2 aprons that I had left there. The telegram was on the console in the antechamber. Knowing that Monsieur was to come direct here, I brought it." "Does Mrs. Brading know you brought it?" As for Mrs. Brading, Monsieur—" Marie stopped, disclaiming any responsibility for Mrs. Brading, of whom she was somewhat jealous. "I thought to do well." "I am sure of it, but surely you can see you have been indiscreet. Don't do it again." "No, Monsieur. I ask pardon of Monsieur." Immediately afterwards he said to Christine in a gay, careless tone, "And this gas stove here, is it all right? Have we tried it? Let us try it." "The weather is warm, dearest." "But just to try it. I always like to satisfy myself in time." "Wasser!" she exclaimed, and ignited the stove. He gazed at it absently, then picked up a cigarette, and, taking the telegram from his pocket, folded it into a spill, and with it lit the cigarette. "Yes," he said meditatively, "it seems not a bad stove." And he held the spill till it had burnt to his finger ends. Then he extinguished the stove. She said to herself, "He's burnt the telegram on purpose, but how cleverly he did it! Ah, that man, there is none but him." She was disquieted about the telegram. She feared it. Her superstitiousness was awakened. She thought of her apostasy from Catholicism to Protestantism. She thought of a Holy Virgin angered. And throughout the evening and throughout the night, amid her smiles and teasings and coaxings and caresses and ecstasies and all her accomplished voluptuous girlishness, the image of a resentful Holy Virgin flitted before her. Why should he burn a business telegram? Also, was he not at intervals a little absent-minded? End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 40. The Window. G.J. sat on the oilcloth-covered seat of the large overhanging bay window. Below him was the river, tributary of the Severn, in front the old bridge, with an ancient street rising beyond, and above that the silhouette of the roofs of Ricton, surmounted by the spire of its vast church. To the left was the weir, and the cliffs were there also, and the last tints of the sunset. Somebody came into the coffee-room. G.J. looked round, hoping that it might, after all, be Concepcion. But it was Concepcion's maid, Emily, an imitative young woman who seemed to have caught from her former employer the quality of strange, sinister provocativeness. She paused a moment before speaking. Her thin figure was somewhat indistinct in the twilight. "Mrs. Smith wishes me to say that she will certainly be well enough to take you to the station in the morning, sir," said she in her specious tones, "but she hopes you will be able to stay to the afternoon train." "I shan't." He shook his head. "Very well, sir." And after another moment's pause, Emily, apparently with a challenging reluctance, receded through the shadows of the room and vanished. G.J. was extremely depressed and somewhat indignant. He gazed down bitterly at the water, following with his eye the incredibly long branches of the tree that from the height of the buttresses drooped perpendicularly into the water. He had had an astounding weekend, and for having responded to Concepcion's telegram, for having taken the telegram seriously, he deserved what he got. Thus he argued. She met him on the hot Saturday afternoon in a Ford car. She did not look ill. She looked as if she had very recently recovered from her acute neurasthenia. She was smartly and carelessly dressed in a summer sporting costume, and had made a strong contrast to every other human being on the platform of the small provincial station. The car drove not to the famous principal hotel, but to a small hotel just beyond the bridge. She had given him tea in the coffee-room, and taken him out again on foot, showing him the town, the half-timbered houses, the immense castle, the market hall, the spacious flat-fronted residences, the multiplicity of solicitors, banks, and surveyors, the bursting provision shops with imposing fractions of animals and expensive pies, and the drapers with ladies' blouses at 2 shillings and 4pence. Then she had conducted him to an organ recital in the vast church, where, amid faint gas-jets and beadles and stalls and stained glass and holiness and centuries of history and the high respectability of the town, she had whispered sibilantly, and other people had whispered, in the long intervals of the organ. She had removed him from the church before the collection for the Red Cross, and when they had eaten a sort of dinner, she had borne him away to the Russian dancers in the Moot Hall. She said she had seen the Russian dancers once already, and that they were richly worth to him a 6 hours' train journey. The posters of the Russian dancers were rather daring and seductive. The Russian dancers themselves were the most desolating stage spectacle that G.J. had ever witnessed. The troupe consisted of intensely English girls of various ages and girl children. The costumes had obviously been fabricated by the artistes. The artistes could neither dance, pose, group, make an entrance, make an exit, or even smile. The ballets, obviously fabricated by the same persons as the costumes, had no plot, no beginning, and no end. Crude amateurishness was the characteristic of these honest and hard-working professionals, who somehow contrived to be neither men nor women, and assuredly not epicene, but who travelled from country town to country town in a glamour of posters, exciting the towns in spite of a perfect lack of sex, because they were the fabled Russian dancers. The Moot Hall was crammed with adults and their cackling offspring, who heartily applauded the show, which indeed was billed as a return visit due to terrific success on a previous occasion. "Is it not too marvellous?" Concepcion had said. He had admitted that it was, but the boredom had been excruciating. In the street they had bought an evening paper, of which he had never before heard the name, to learn news of the war. The war, however, seemed very far off. It had grown unreal. "We'll talk tomorrow," Concepcion had said, and gone abruptly to bed. Still, he had slept well in the soft climate, to the everlasting murmur of the weir. Then the Sunday. She was indisposed, could not come down to breakfast, but hoped to come down to lunch, could not come down to lunch, but hoped to come down to tea, could not come down to tea, and so on to nightfall. The Sunday had been like 1,000 years to him. He had learnt the town and the suburbs of it, the grass-grown streets, the main thoroughfares, and the slums. By the afternoon he was recognizing familiar faces in the town. He had twice made the classic round, along the cliffs, over the new bridge, which was an antique, up the hill to the castle, through the market-place, down the high street to the older bridge. He had explored the brain of the landlord, who could not grapple with a timetable, and who spent most of the time during closed hours impatiently bolting the front door, which G.J. was continually opening. He talked to the old customer, who, whenever the house was open, sat at a table in the garden over a mug of cider. He played through all the musical comedies, dance albums, and pianoforte albums that littered the piano. He had read the same Sunday papers that he read in the Albany, and he had learnt the life history of the sole servant, a very young, agreeable woman with a wedding ring and a baby, which baby she carried about with her when serving at table. Her husband was in France. She said that as soon as she had received his permission to do so, she would leave, as she really could not get through all the work of the hotel and mind and feed the baby. She said also that she played the piano herself, and she regretted that baby and pressure of work had deprived her of a sight of the Russian dancers, because she had heard so much about them, and was sure they were beautiful. This detail touched G.J.'s heart to a mysterious and sweet and almost intolerable melancholy. He had not made the acquaintance of fellow guests, for there were none, save Concepcion and Emily. And in the evening, as in the morning, the weir placidly murmured, and the river slipped smoothly between the huge jutting buttresses of the old bridge, and the thought of the perpetuity of the river, in whose mirror the venerable town was a mushroom, obsessed him, mastered him, and made him as old as the river. He was wonder-struck and sorrow-struck by life, and by his own life, and by the inconceivable and angering fantasy of Concepcion. His week-end took on the appearance of the monstrous. Then the door opened again, and Concepcion entered in a white gown, the antithesis of her sporting costume of the day before. She approached through the thickening shadows of the room, and the vague whiteness of her gown reminded him of the whiteness of the form climbing the chimney-ladder on the roof of Letchford House in the raid. Knowing her, he ought to have known that, having made him believe that she would not come down, she would certainly come down. He restrained himself, showing no untoward emotion, and said in a calm, genial voice, "Oh, I'm so glad you were well enough to come down." She sat opposite to him in the window-seat, rather sideways, so that her skirt was pulled close round her left thigh and flowed free over the right. He could see her still plainly in the dusk. "I've never yet apologized to you for my style of behaviour at the committee of yours," she began abruptly in a soft, kind, reasonable voice. "I know I let you down horribly. Yes, I did. And I ought to apologize to you for today, too. But I don't think I'll apologize to you for bringing you to Ricton and this place. They're not real, you know. They're an illusion. There's no such place as Ricton and this river and this window. There couldn't be, could there? Queen and I motored over here once from Paul, it's not so very far, and we agreed that it didn't really exist. I never forgot it. I was determined to come here again some time, and that's why I chose this very spot when half Harley Street stood up and told me I must go away somewhere after my cure and be by myself, far from the pernicious influence of friends. I think I gave you a very fair idea of the town yesterday, but I didn't show you the funniest thing in it, the inside of a solicitor's office. You remember the large grey stone house in Mill Street, the grass street, you know, with Simpover and Simpover on the brass plate, and the strip of green felt nailed all round the front door to keep the wind out in winter? Well, it's all in the same key inside. And I don't know which is the funniest, the Russian dancers, or the green felt round the front door, or Mr. Simpover, or the other Mr. Simpover. I'm sure neither of those men is real, though they both somehow have children. You remember the yellow cars that you see in so many of the windows? A man has gone from his house to fight for king and country. The elder Mr. Simpover thinks it would be rather boastful to put the card in the window, so he keeps it on the mantelpiece in his private office. It's for his son. And yet I assure you the father isn't real. He's like the town. He simply couldn't be real. What have you been up to in the private office? G.J. asked lightly. Making my will. What for? Isn't it the proper thing to do? I've left everything to you. You haven't, Con, he protested. There was absolutely no tranquillity about this woman. With her, the disconcerting unexpected happened every 5 minutes. Did you suppose I was going to send any of my possessions back to my tropical relatives in South Africa? I've left everything to you to do what you like with. Squander it if you like, but I expect you'll give it to war charities. Anyhow, I thought it would be safest in your hands. He retorted in a tone quietly and sardonically challenging. But I was under the impression you were cured. Of my neurasthenia? Yes. I believe I am. I gained 13 pounds in the nursing home and slept like a greengrocer. In fact, the Weir Mitchell treatment, with modern improvements, of course, enjoyed a marvellous triumph in my case. But that's not the point, G.J. I know you think I behaved very childishly yesterday, and that I deserved to be ill today for what I did yesterday. And I admit you're a saint for not saying so. But I wasn't really childish, and I haven't really been ill today. I've only been in a devil of a dilemma. I wanted to tell you something. I telegraphed for you so that I could tell you. But as soon as I saw you, I was afraid to tell you. Not afraid, but I couldn't make up my mind whether I ought to tell you or not. I've lain in bed all day trying to decide the point. Tonight I decided I oughtn't. And then all of a sudden, just now, I became an automaton and put on some things, and here I am, telling you." She paused. G.J. kept silence. Then she continued in a voice in which persuasiveness was added to calm, engaging reasonableness. "Now you must get rid of all your conventional ideas, G.J., because you're rather conventional. You must be completely straight, I mean intellectually, otherwise I can't treat you as an intellectual equal, and I want to. You must be a realist, if any man can be." She spoke almost with tenderness. He felt mysteriously shy, and with a brusque movement of the head shifted his glance from her to the river. "Well?" he questioned, his gaze fixed on the water that continually slipped in large, swirling, glinting sheets under the bridge. "I'm going to kill myself." At first the words made no impression on him. He replied, "You were right when you said this place was an illusion. It is." And then he began to be afraid. Did she mean it? She was capable of anything. And he was involved in her inescapably. Yes, he was afraid. Nevertheless, as she kept silence, he went on, with bravado, "And how do you intend to do it?" "That will be my affair. But I venture to say that my way of doing it will make Ricton historic," she said, curiously gentle. "Trust you!" he exclaimed, suddenly looking at her. "Con, why will you always be so theatrical?" She changed her posture for an easier one, half reclining. Her face and demeanour seemed to have the benign masculinity of a man's. "I'm sorry," she answered. "I ought to have said that. At any rate, to you. I ought to have had more respect for your feelings." He said, "You aren't cured, that's evident. All this is physical." "Of course it's physical, G.J.," she agreed, with an intonation of astonishment that he should be guilty of an utterance so obvious and banal. "Did you ever know anything that wasn't? Did you ever even conceive anything that wasn't? If you can't show me how to conceive spirit except in terms of matter, I'd like to listen to you." "It's against nature to kill yourself." "Oh," she murmured, "I'm quite used to that charge. You aren't by any means the first to accuse me of being against nature. But can you tell me where nature ends? That's another thing I'd like to know. My dear friend, you're being conventional, and you aren't being realistic. You must know perfectly well in your heart that there's no reason why I shouldn't kill myself if I want to. You aren't going to talk to me about the 10 Commandments, I suppose, are you? There's a risk, of course, on the other side, sure, but perhaps it's worth taking. You aren't in a position to say it isn't worth taking, and at worst the other shore must be marvellous. It may possibly be terrible if you arrive too soon and without being asked, but it must be marvellous. Naturally I believe in immortality. If I didn't, the thing wouldn't be worth doing. Oh, I should hate to be extinguished. But to change one existence for another, if the fancy takes you, that seems to me the greatest proof of real independence that anybody can give. It's tremendous. You're playing chess with fate, and fate's winning, and you knock up the chessboard, and fate has to begin all over again. Can't you see how tremendous it is? And how tempting it is? The temptation is terrific." "I can see all that," said G.J. He was surprised by a sudden sense of esteem for the mighty volition hidden behind those calm, worn, gracious features. For Concepcion's body was younger than her face. He perceived, as it were for the first time, that Concepcion was immeasurably younger than himself, and yet she had passed far beyond him in experience. "But what's the origin of all this? What do you want to do it for? What's happened?" "Then you believe I mean to do it?" "Yes," he replied sincerely, and as naturally as he could. "That's the tone I like to hear," said she, smiling. "I felt sure I could count on you not to indulge in too much nonsense. Well, I'm going to try the next avatar just to remind Fate of my existence. I think Fate's forgotten me, and I can stand anything but that. I've lost Carly, and I've lost Queen. Oh, G.J., isn't it awful to think that when I offered you Queen, she'd already gone, and it was only her dead body I was offering you? And I've lost my love. And I've failed, and I shall never be any more good here. I swore I would see a certain thing through, and I haven't seen it through, and I can't. But I've told you all this before. What's left? Even my unhappiness is leaving me. Unless I kill myself, I shall cease to exist. Don't you understand? Yes, you do. After a marked pause, she added, And I may overtake Queen. That's one thing I don't understand, he said, as we're being frank with each other. Why do you tell me? Has it occurred to you that you're really making me a party to this scheme of yours? He spoke with a perfectly benevolent attachment deriving from hers, and as he spoke he thought of a man whom he had once known and who had committed suicide, and of all that he had read about suicides and what he had thought of them. Suicides had been incomprehensible to him, and either despicable or pitiable. And he said to himself, Here is one of them, or is it an illusion? But she's made all my notions of suicide seem ridiculous. She answered his spoken question with vivacity. Why do I tell you? I don't know. That's the point I've been arguing to myself all night and all day. I'm not telling you. Something in me is forcing me to tell you. Perhaps it's much more important that you should comprehend me than that you should be spared the passing worry that I'm causing you by showing you the inside of my head. You're the only friend I have left. I knew you before I knew Carney. I practically committed suicide from my particular world at the beginning of the war. I was going back to my particular world. You remember, GJ, in that little furnished flat? I was going back to it, but you wouldn't let me. It was you who definitely cut me off from my past. I might have been gadding about safely with Sarah Churcher and her lot at this very hour, but you would have it otherwise, and so I finished up with neurasthenia. You commanded, and I obeyed. Well, he said, ignoring all her utterance except the last words, obey me again. What do you want me to do? She demanded, wistfully and yet defiantly. Her features were tending to disappear in the tide of night, but she happened to sit up and lean forward and bring them a little closer to him. You've no right to stop me from doing what I want to do. What right have you to stop me? Besides, you can't stop me. Nothing can stop me. It is settled. Everything is arranged. He too sat up and leaned forward, in a voice rendered soft by the realization of the fact that he had indeed known her before Carlos Smith knew her, and had imagined himself once to be in love with her, and of the harshness of her destiny and the fading of her glory. He said simply, and yet, in spite of himself, insinuatingly, No, I don't claim any right to stop you. I understand better, perhaps, than you think. But let me come down again next weekend. Do let me, he insisted, still more softly. Even while he was speaking, he expected her to say, You're only suggesting that in order to gain time. But she said, How can you be sure it won't be my inquest and funeral I should be letting you come down to? He replied, I could trust you. A delicate night gust, charged with the scent of some plant, came in at the open window and arranged ever so slightly a glistening lock on her forehead. GJ, peering at her, saw the masculinity melt from her face. He saw the mysterious resurrection of the girl in her, and felt in himself the sudden exciting outflow from her of that temperamental fluid whose springs had been dried up since the day when she learnt of her widowhood. She flushed. He looked away into the dark water, as though he had profanely witnessed that which ought not to be witnessed. Earlier in the interview she had inspired him with shyness. He was now stirred, agitated, thrilled, overwhelmed by the effect on her of his own words and his own voice. He was afraid of his power, as a prophet might be afraid of his power. He had worked a miracle infinitely more convincing than anything that had led up to it. The miracle had brought back the rain of reality. Very well, she quivered, and there was a movement, and she was gone. He glanced quickly behind him, but the room lay black, a transient pallor on the blackness, and the door banged. He sat a long time, solemn, gazing at the serrated silhouette of the town against a sky that obstinately held the wraith of daylight, and listening to the everlasting murmur of the invisible weir. Not a sound came from the town, not the least sound. When at length he stumbled out, he saw the figure of the landlord smoking the pipe of philosophy, and waiting with a landlord's fatalism for the last guest to go to bed. And they talked of the weather. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 41. The Envoy. The next night, G.J., having been hailed by an acquaintance, was talking at the top of the steps beneath the portal of a club in Piccadilly. It was after 10 by the clocks, and nearly, but not quite, dark. A warm, rather heavy evening shower had ceased. This was the beginning of the great Mackintosh epoch, by-product of the war, when the paucity of the means of vehicular locomotion had rendered mackintoshes permissible, even for women with pretensions to smartness, and at intervals stylish girls on their way home from unaccustomed overtime passed the doors in transparent mackintoshes of pink, yellow, or green, as scornful as military officers of the effeminate umbrella, whose use was being confined to clubmen and old dowdies. The acquaintance sought advice from G.J. about the shutting up of households for Belgian refugees. G.J. answered abstinently, not conceding that he was in a hurry. He had in fact been held up within 3 minutes of the scene of his secret idyll, and was anxious to arrive there. He had promised himself this surprise visit to Christine as some sort of recompense and narcotic for the immense disturbance of spirit which he had suffered at Richton. That morning Concepcion had been invisible. But at his early breakfast he had received a note from her, a brief but masterly composition, if ever so slightly theatrical. He was conscious of tenderness for Concepcion, of sympathy with her, of a desire to help to restore her to that which by misfortune she had lost. But the first of these sentiments he resolutely put aside. He was determined to change his mood towards her for the sake of his own tranquillity, and he convinced himself that his wise, calm common sense was capable of saving her from any tragic and fatal folly. He had her in the hollow of his hand, but if she was expecting too much from him, she would be gradually disappointed. He must have peace. He could not allow a bomb to be thrown into his habits. He was a bachelor over 50, whose habits had the value of inestimable jewels, and whose perfect independence was the most precious thing in the world. At his age he could not marry a volcano, a revolution, a new radioactive element exhibiting properties which were an enigma to social science. Concepcion would turn his existence into an endless drama of which she alone, with her deep-rooted devilish talent for the sensational, would always choose the setting, as she had chosen the window and the weir. No, he must not mistake affectionate sympathy for tenderness, nor tolerate the sexual exploitation of his pity. As he listened and talked to the acquaintance, his inner mind shifted with relief to the vision of Christine, contented and simple and compliant in her nest. Christine, at once restful and exciting. Christine, the exquisite symbol of acquiescence and response. What a contrast to Concepcion! It had been a bold and sudden stroke to lift Christine to another plane, but a stroke well justified and entirely successful, fulfilling his dream. At this moment he noticed a figure pass the doorway in whose shadow he was, and he exclaimed within himself incredulously, "That is Christine!" In the shortest possible delay he said good night to his acquaintance, and jumped down the steps and followed eastwards the figure. He followed warily, for already the strange and distressing idea had occurred to him that he must not overtake her, if she it was. It was she. He caught sight of her again in the thick obscurity by the prison wall of Devonshire House. He recognized the peculiar brim of the new hat and the new military umbrella held on the wrist by a thong. What was she doing abroad? She could not be going to a theatre. She had not a friend in London. He was her London, and La Mère Gaston was not with her. Theoretically, of course, she was free. He laid down no law. But it had been clearly understood between them that she should never emerge at night alone. She herself had promulgated the rule, for she had a sense of propriety and a strong sense of reality. She belonged to the class which respectable, broad-minded women, when they bantered G.J., always called the pretty ladies, and as a postulant for respectability she had for her own satisfaction to mind her P's and Q's. She could not afford not to keep herself above suspicion. She had been a courtesan. Did she look like one? As an individual figure in repose, no. None could have said that she did. He had long since learnt that to decide always correctly by appearance, and apart from environment and gesture, whether an unknown woman was or was not a wanton, presented a task beyond the powers of even the completest experience. But Christine was walking in Piccadilly at night, and he soon perceived that she was discreetly showing the demeanour of a courtesan at her profession, she who had hated and feared the pavement. He knew too well the signs, the waverings, the turns of the head, the variations in speed, the scarcely perceptible hesitations, the unmistakable air of wandering with no definite objective. Near Dover Street he hastened through the thin reflecting mire, amid beams of light and illuminated numbers that advanced upon him in both directions, thundering or purring, and crossed Piccadilly and hurried ahead of her to watch her in safety from the other side of the thoroughfare. He could hardly see her. She was only a moving shadow, but still he could see her, and in the long stretch of gloom beneath the facade of the Royal Academy he saw the shadow pause in front of a military figure, which, by a flank movement, avoided the shadow and went resolutely forward. He lost her in front of the Piccadilly Hotel, and found her again at the corner of Eyre Street. She swerved into Eyre Street and crossed Regent Street. He was following. In Denman Street, close to Shaftesbury Avenue, she stood still in front of another military figure, a common soldier as it proved, who also rebuffed her. The thing was flagrant. He halted, and deliberately let her go from his sight. She vanished into the dark crowds of the avenue. In horrible humiliation, in atrocious disgust, he said to himself, "Never would I set eyes on her again. Never, never." Why was she doing it? Not for money. She could only be doing it from the nostalgia of adventurous debauch. She was the slave of her temperament, as the drunkard is the slave of his thirst. He had told her that he would be out of town for the week-end, on committee business. He distinctly told her that she must on no account expect him on the Monday night. And her temperament had roused itself from the obscene groves of her subconsciousness like a tiger, and come up and driven her forth. How easy for her to escape from La Mère Gaston, if she chose. And yet, would she dare, even at the bidding of the tiger, to introduce a stranger into the flat? Unnecessary, he reflected. There were 100 accommodating dubious interiors between Shaftesbury Avenue and Leicester Square. He understood. He neither accused nor pardoned, but he was utterly revolted, and wounded not merely in his soul, but in the most sensitive part of his soul, his pride. He called himself by the worst epithet of opprobrium, simpleton. The bold and sudden stroke had now become the fatuous caprice of a damned fool. Had he, at his age, been capable of overlooking the elementary axiom, once a wrong 'un, always a wrong 'un? Had he believed in reclamation? He laughed out his disgust. No, he did not blame her. To blame her would have been ridiculous. She was only what she was, and not worth blame. She was nothing at all. How right, how cursedly right, were the respectable dames in the accent of amused indifference which they employed for their precious phrase, the pretty ladies. Well, he would treat her generously, but through his lawyer. And in the desolation, the dismay, the disillusion, the nausea which ravaged him, he was unwillingly conscious of fragments of thoughts that flickered like transient flames far below in the deep mines of his being. "You are an astounding woman, Con. Do you want me to go to the bad altogether?" In offering him Queen, had not Concepcion made the supreme double sacrifice of attempting to bring together, at the price of her own separation from both of them, the two beings to whom she was most profoundly attached? It was a marvellous deed. Worry, volcanoes, revolutions, was he afraid of them? Were they not the very essence of life? Figure of nobility! Sitting there now by the window over the river, listening to the Wear, "I shall never be any more good." But she never had a gesture that was not superb. Was he really encrusted in habits, really like men whom he knew and despised at his club? She loved him, and what rich, flattering love was her love compared to... She was young. Tenderness. Such were the flames of dim promise that nickered immeasurably beneath the dark devastation of his mind. He ignored them, but he could not ignore them. He extinguished them, but they were continually relighted. A wedding? What sort of a wedding? Poor Carlos! pathetically buried under the ruthless happiness of others. What a shame! Poor Carlos. Nice enough little cocotte, nothing else, but of course incurable. He remembered all her crimes now, how she had been late in dressing for their first dinner, her inexplicable vanishing from the supper party, never explained, but easily explicable now, perhaps, and so on, and so on. Simpleton. Ass. He had walked heedless of direction. He was near Letchford House. Many of its windows were lit, the great front doors were open, a commissionaire stood on the guard in front of them. To the railings was affixed a newly painted notice. No person will be allowed to enter these premises without a pass. To this rule there is no exception. Letchford House had been taken over in its entirety by a government department that believed in the virtue of mystery and of long hours. He looked up at the higher windows. He could not distinguish the chimney amid the newly revealed stars. He thought of Queen, the white woman. Evidently he had never understood Queen, for if Concepcion admired her, she was worth admiration. Concepcion never made a mistake in assessing fundamental character. The complete silent absorption of Letchford House into the war machine rather dismayed him. He had seen not a word as to the affair in the newspapers, and Letchford House was one of the final strongholds of privilege. He strolled on into the quietness of the park, of which one of the gatekeepers said to him that it would be shutting in a few minutes. He was in solitude and surrounded by London. He stood still, and the vast sea of war seemed to be closing over him. The war was growing, or the sense of its measureless scope was growing. It had sprung, not out of this crime or that, but out of the secret, invisible roots of humanity, and it was widening to the limits of evolution itself. It transcended judgment, it defied conclusions, and rendered equally impossible both hope and despair. His pride in his country was intensified as months passed. His faith in his country was not lessened. And yet, wherein was the efficacy of grim words about British tenacity? The great new Somme offensive was not succeeding in the north. Was victory possible? Was victory deserved? In his daily labour he was brought into contact with too many instances of official selfishness, folly, ignorance, stupidity, and sloth, French as well as British, not to marvel at times that the conflict had not come to an ignominious end long ago through simple lack of imagination. He knew that he himself had often failed in devotion, in rectitude, in sheer grit. The supreme lesson of the war was its revelation of what human nature actually was. And the solace of the lesson, the hope for triumph, lay in the fact that human nature must be substantially the same throughout the world. If we were humanly imperfect, so at least was the enemy. Perhaps the frame of society was about to collapse. Perhaps Queen, deliberately courting destruction and being destroyed, was the symbol of society. What matter? Perhaps civilization, by its nobility and its elements of reason, and by the favour of destiny, would be saved from disaster after frightful danger, and Concepcion was its symbol. All he knew was that he had a heavy day's work before him on the morrow, and in relief from pain and insoluble problems, he turned to face that work, thankful. Thankful that, owing originally to Queen, he had discovered in the war a task which suited his powers, which was genuinely useful, and which would only finish with the war. Thankful for the prospect of meeting Concepcion at the weekend, and exploring with her the marvellous provocative potentialities that now drew them together. Thankful, too, that he had a balanced and sagacious mind, and could judge justly. Yes, he was already forgetting his bitter condemnation of himself as a simpleton. How in his human self-sufficiency could he be expected to know that he had judged the negligible Christine unjustly? Was he divine, that he could see in the figure of the wanton who peered at soldiers in the street a self-convinced mystic envoy of the most clement Virgin, an envoy passionately repentant after apostasy, bound at all costs to respond to an imagined voice long unheard and seeking, though in vain this second time, the protégé of the Virgin, so that she might once more succour and assuage his affliction? End of chapter 41. End of The Pretty Lady by Arnold Bennett.